will be submitted as part of the next scheduled meeting for approval, because these two meetings have been held very close together. So we don't have any minutes to approve right now. Moving on to questions from members of the public. Do we have any questions from members of the public?
Yes, Chair. A question and response has been published in Supplement 2 to the papers, and we also have Ms Reid in attendance to ask a supplementary question.
I don't recall having said it in my chairman's taradiddle, but can we make sure that a member of the public is not on camera whilst asking a supplementary question? Ms Reid, if you'd like to ask your supplementary, thank you very much for attending.
Hello, can you hear? Firstly, occasionally in the past, information requests from the Children and Young People Scrutiny Committee have not been timely dealt with. In my public question, I pointed out the report entitled Children and Young People Directorate Budget Task and Finish Group was not on this meeting's webpage on 11th of January 2024. At 1 p.m. today, it is still not on the meeting's webpage. I noticed the matter is also on the agenda of the Children and Young People Scrutiny Committee meeting on Tuesday 23rd of January 2024, but the report is not on that meeting's website as at 1 p.m. today. Therefore, I understand that the report is late for that meeting. In what ways will the Scrutiny Management Board ensure that in future reports, etc., are available on time before its own meetings and other councils' meetings?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Ms Reid. And yes, it is unfortunate that some of the meeting papers for today's meeting were delivered late, and unfortunately it is a function of putting the budget together this time of year and over the Christmas and New Year period. There is a lot of work to get through, and it does make it a struggle to provide the information in a timely fashion to be published as part of the agenda. You're right, we were planning on having the Children and Young People's Task and Finish Group report coming to this meeting, but similarly we've faced difficulties getting the report completed and approved, which is why it's been placed on the agenda for the Children's Scrutiny Committee next week to take it directly rather than it coming back through Scrutiny Management Board. The hope and expectation is that we will have the report published before the weekend, so that committee members have and the public have the weekend and Monday to look at it. But unfortunately, it is likely, therefore, also to be outside of the time frame for receipt of public questions. I don't know whether there's any scope to do anything about that. It would be unfortunate if it was going to miss the public opportunity to submit questions on the back of it twice. But I will look into that, and if there is any way of being able to accommodate public questions on it, we'll make that clear when the report is published. We'll make it clear one way or the other when the report is published. But thank you for your question. It is the intention of this committee to look at the whole cycle of budget scrutiny at our March meeting for the coming year, and to make recommendations in terms of how we can try and reduce the time pressures that are created during the budgeting process, in order to both improve public engagement but also reduce the pressures on officers and members in terms of being able to undertake thoughtful development of the budget and an appropriate level of scrutiny. And any public comment and suggestions associated with that would be welcome ahead of our meeting. So I just apologise that we haven't got the report to this meeting and that it's going to be late to Children's also. Councillor Stark, you're indicating here.
I don't know what the protocol is, Chair, since this has come about from a question from the public, but my committee's also got a report that is late. I just wonder whether this board wants to think about perhaps having a recommendation just to remind officers about the importance of reports being delivered to scrutiny in time, so we have all the information that we need to actually have proper substantive discussions on the day. Chair.
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of take that as a recommendation. We also have the Chief Executive and the Leader of the Council in the room today, and whilst we are all very mindful of the pressures associated with developing the budget pack, it is an issue in terms of late reports coming to scrutiny, which, you know, is not just associated with the budget, but is associated with other committees, and it's something that has been experienced for a while. So very welcome making that recommendation, and officers seeing what they can do to schedule things into the governance process and the forward plan appropriately. Vice Chair.
Yeah, just to add, it is actually a constitutional requirement to have our papers ready for public and councillor scrutiny and any questions that arise. So to be back in line with the constitution would be quite useful as well. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, move on to questions from councillors. Oh, sorry, Chief Executive, didn't spot you there.
I'm aware of the lateness of the children and young people scrutiny item, but I wasn't aware of the other item referred to. If you let me follow that up and find out what's getting in the way, notwithstanding the recommendation from the scrutiny management board, let me understand what's getting in the way, what's gone wrong, if it's gone wrong here, and see if we can speed that up. And we'll come back to you informally as well, confirm informally.
Thank you, Chief Executive. That's appreciated. And with that, we move on to questions from councillors. I don't believe we have had any questions from councillors submitted. So with that, we move on to agenda item 7, which is a continuation of scrutiny of the draft budget. We have had 2 items deferred from the previous meeting, which covered the corporate element of the budget and also the capital programme. I understand that some officers are not able to join us until the second hour of our meeting, so I'm happy to defer detailed discussion of the corporate element of the budget until officers are able to join us. We do have do we have a running order for the remainder of the reports that we're looking at today?
Yes, Chair, we do. So to facilitate the late arrival of officers, we're going to take the capital budget first, followed then by the medium-term financial strategy.
Thank you. And given the time pressures and that we don't have a third meeting as a luxury to defer items to, we're looking at taking 20 minutes max for the capital programme, 45 minutes for the medium-term financial strategy. Vice Chair, I'd appreciate it if you clock watched on our behalf.
I will.
Thank you.
Yeah, we need to get a move on.
Yeah. So turning to the capital programme, have I got questions from committee members on that item? Not. Councillor Fagan.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to actually look at the schemes that quickly ask about the school's accessibility scheme and the children's residential homes for 11 to 18-year-olds. So if I could just have some sort of clarification about the school's accessibility team, what that that's a proposed addition over the next 4 years, sort of what that covers, and also in terms of the residential homes for 11 to 18-year-olds, there's obviously a capital element, but the revenue element of that is how, you know, have we built in enough capacity to be able to deal with that revenue element of running that home? So it's on page 89 of the capital investment budget on the website. It's under resource implications.
Wrong button. Councillor Stoddart.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Fagan, so firstly, looking at the school's accessibility works, that's I've got that in my capital programme as that's having a total budget of £1.5 million. It's basically looking at 9 children that require adaptations into schools. The schools that children will attend have not been determined, so we're at the minute we've got 9 children we're looking to put into schools. We don't know which schools, and therefore it will not be known until next. Well, not next now. It's this April. In May, ready for acceptance to school in the September term. And that's the plan that we're looking for there. As I say, total of 1.5 million.
So is that actually is that a revenue cost, or is that that is a capital cost? Okay. And then in terms of so does that fall under the designated schools, the DSG budget, or does it sort of sit somewhere else? Where?
It's under schools accessibility works.
Yeah.
No, it's not part of DSG.
No. Okay, but it is to do with high needs.
Yeah,
it's a high needs requirement. All right, thank you. And also just in terms of the revenue costs of the children's residential homes, if you could clarify that, please.
So the second one you're referring to is the children's residential homes for 11 to 18-year-olds, provider source staff and council purchased accommodation. So that is effectively that's a mixture of capital and revenue. It's £424,000 of capital, which is for the purchase and immobilisation cost of the 2x2 bedroom homes. Where you're into is the revenue costs, and again, it's £1.743 million for the running of the cost of that, and that's a revenue cost.
And has that been included in the children's services budget? Is that revenue cost, the running cost?
It has, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Vice Chair.
Thank you. And can you confirm that those revenue costs were in the revenue papers that came to us last week?
Yes, Vice Chair, I can confirm that they're in those papers, yeah.
Thank you. And my other question, going back to school accessibility. So obviously we're waiting on the allocation of the schools for the children that will be attending as they transition into that school. Are these sort of costs then recurring capital costs for children as they transition to schools where they need adaptation? So we're looking at a set amount of children that we know that we're going to have to help in the coming school year. So are we, do we need to do this every year? Is this going to be an ongoing cost where we need to adapt schools every year? Do we have an indication of what that kind of pressure might look to our budget?
It's not a recurring cost. It is a cost for this year. We've been informed that through education, they believe there's 9 this year. And again, next year we will then get the information back through from our educators to say that there could be 5 or 6 or 7. We don't know yet.
But so there is a recurrence in
Potentially
needing
a
to
recurring
find
cost.
a budget line.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
But remember, it's a capital recurring cost, potentially a capital recurring cost.
Councillor Stark.
I've got one specific question following on from a question that I raised on the 10th. And then I've got a general question about the relation of the capital budget in total to the MRP. I know, Chair, that strays into the MTFS, but I think that's inevitable when you're talking about budget matters. At the last meeting, Councillor Stoddart, I raised the point about the additional programme that covered 550,000 being spent on care homes. I wasn't aware that we had care homes that we were responsible for. I mean, Hillside, I wasn't aware that was actually described as a care home. I'm concerned, Councillor Stoddart, that these outlying business cases that are presented before us, and I'm just using that as an example, really should have enough information so that we can actually interpret what exactly the money is being spent on, because that is the only information that we have before us. And I didn't know about that, and I'm still a bit perplexed about how we've ended up having to spend over £500,000 on 2 care homes that I didn't even know were within our responsibility. I think there's a wider issue there that I would like people to consider the outline business case and ask themselves the question, if I was one of the scrutiny members, would that be enough information for me to actually make sense of that particular spend, Councillor Stoddart? So that's my first point.
So can I come for your questions regarding the actual title of the Estates Building Improvement Programme 24 to 27 and the building works for the 2022 condition surveys? That's the item you're referring to.
There's an item for care homes in that particular addition that we were given.
Oh, sorry. Yep, got it. Yep, the 550k.
I got the answer at the last meeting, Councillor Stoddart, that these were care homes that were within our responsibility, although I don't understand how we've ended up with building costs that we've actually inherited from perhaps private providers, but that may be for audit and governance to pick up. But what I'm saying is the outline business case wasn't sufficient for me to actually understand that that was the actual case, and I just want officers to make sure that even though it's only an outline business case, I understand it's not a full business case, they provide enough information so that we can actually interpret it when we come to read it.
Okay. Well, obviously, the one thing we're always keen to do is provide as much information we can. So the aims and the objectives, as it shows in the outline strategic business case, are to ensure the council's estate is maintained, it saves fit for purpose, address identified risks, reduce the revenue expenditure, extend the life cycle, secure better services, support the reduction of carbon footprint, and then support the delivery of the county plan. So that's what it's. What more are you looking for? The individual specific detail of what each one of those items will be?
Well, I didn't know the care homes were our responsibility. I thought they might have been private providers' responsibility. And I'm still concerned about how we've ended up with this course in our sort of capital programme.
They are owned by us.
Yeah, now. Yeah. I wasn't aware of that, that's all I'm saying.
Can I take that maybe what we therefore might need to do is to inform all of our council members of what assets we actually own? I think that might be a prudent thing that we do, because obviously whilst officers are aware and certain members are aware, obviously yourself and others who I'm sure are informed and interested, it may have slipped beyond them. So would you like us to take an action point to brief not just scrutiny management, but the whole council on what actually we hold by either a simple document to you? Would that be of use?
I think, seeing as we already publish this information on the council website, we have a list of all of the council-owned assets on the website. it might be more helpful in the context of putting outline business cases and full business cases together for specific investments, that it's made clear where we are making an investment in a property that we own or that we lease, where we have, repairing lease responsibilities. There are some instances where we have made investments in developments for schools where we don't own the buildings, the schools are an academy, but we have other obligations, legal obligations, under which we are required to, make these investments, or the investments come through us from central government. I think one of the things that we were reminded of by the Council's financial consultants link group when we were being updated on Treasury management is that according to SIPFA Prudential and Treasury Management Codes of Practice, there's an increased and increasing emphasis on governance and scrutiny around council's capital strategies, and that each council's capital strategy should contain, and I'm just going to read these through from the consultants' slides, an appropriate level of detail in respect of legal power for the capital scheme to be undertaken, evidence of robust options appraisal work having taken place, consideration and quantification of sensitivity analysis outcomes, impact of revenue, budget and balance sheet resources, Section 151 officer to vouch for the skill sets of external consultants used, and committee members to be adequately briefed on any material risks. And I think that kind of underpins and reinforces the point, Councillor Stark, that you were making about the adequacy of the information that was provided. So I think where we have business cases for each line of the capital programme, has this information been provided? And where could committee members expect to see this information in the cases provided to support the proposed additions to the programme for 2024-25?
Thanks, Chair. So I take from that where we're looking at on the outline strategic business case for the improvements in the product aims and objectives. You would like to, rather than just saying it's a programme of work, you'd like to know the specific buildings it's going into. Is that the first point?
I think the requirement in terms of codes of practice are that this information is provided. If it is provided, it would be helpful to guide us to where that is in the documents that we've got before us. If it's not provided, can it please be provided for the additions, and can we receive assurance that all these requirements will be met before spending is sanctioned on any individual project within the capital programme?
What I can say is that it is an outline strategic business case. I accept that we should, for full transparency, we should have put in there that it refers to, for example, a care home in South Bank Road, whatever. But what I would say is before any expenditure takes place, there will be a full business case, and that will include all of that detail. So again, I hold my hand up. We will speak, and we will look to include a bit more detail into the outline piece on it. You mentioned, Chair, that about the strategy and the code. Can I remind you that the specifics are not included in that code, and that what you're quoting from is good practice offered by our advisor, but we should look to do it.
Thank you. If I could ask that the provision of this information, is in place for the items that are live in our capital programme, and that for the additions that it's provided, and the degree to which it can be provided at outline business case stage. I recognise some of the information can only be provided at detailed business case stage. but where it can be provided at outline stage, that it is provided, and maybe we have a checklist so that, you know, we can be clear that, you know, where the information is able to be provided at a particular stage in the development of the business case and the justification for adding it to the programme. I think the point about making sure that all of the requirements have been met in terms of good practice before any spending is sanctioned on individual projects within the programme is also something that it's important that we receive assurance on. And you know, if we could put that down as a recommendation, I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Well, I can guarantee that, as I say, these are outline business cases, and that before any spend decision, then of course all the points raised will be included in the full business case. As we've alluded to, wherever possible in the outline strategic business case, we'll include more detail. But for example, in the previous example with the 9 children, we don't know what schools they are. So at the minute, it's down to the parents when they raise the case through the education system that we actually then pick up on that. So at the minute, we believe there's 9, but we don't know what the schools are. So that's as much information as we have at the time.
Thank you for clarifying that. And before I come back to you, Councillor, are you wanting to follow up on this particular point?
Well, I just want to make the point that in the absence of a county plan, we're relying on the capital programme in terms of almost having to understand why this expenditure is going on. That's why I took a close interest, Councillor Stoddart, particularly in this one. Maybe too close an interest, I'm sorry.
No, there's never such a thing as too close an interest. We're very, I'm very pleased to see the interest being paid there. You mentioned the county plan. That's very much work going on at the minute, and of course tied into there will then come the delivery plan for the next year. And as Councillor Chan and I have spoken about, my intention is in that delivery plan will include the financial lines, so we can actually see all the way through how that is delivered and how it's funded. So that's work that's ongoing and will be coming out as we know in the early part of next financial year.
Okay, thank you. A question from me then. I note that the administration is proposing to extend further the drawing forward of future years' borrowing, as indicated in the table at paragraph 17 of the capital strategy, which is on page 90 of the agenda pack from the 10th of January. Please, could you explain the thinking on this?
Could you just confirm that's the taking forward of the transformation of £1.6 million? Is that what you're alluding to?
No, it's paragraph 17 of the capital strategy report, and it's on page 90 of the agenda pack from the 10th of January.
Sorry about that. I was finding documents everywhere at the minute.
Don't worry.
But what I can say is that is the same plan that was in existence last year with the previous administration. So there's no change there.
Well, you've added a year on the end of it. Have you not, through to 2027, 28?
But we are following the same principle. We're rolling forward.
Yeah. Well, for the public and for this as a committee, could you explain the thinking behind that?
Chair, the approach in paragraph 17, the table there, the principle is that we're looking forward, and this is full projection on our capital programme, is looking about forward funding of those arrangements. So the principle is the same that the previous budget was set on, having that longer term view about the capital programme for the council. Capital projects are delivered over a number of years, where our revenue budget is linked to financial years.
Okay, so what we have here is a picture which fully commits the present level of additional borrowing each year through to 2027-28 on the programme as it is currently presented.
That's correct.
Okay. Right. I understand. I understand that is what you're doing, and I understand that it continues a practice that was introduced last year. Now the capital programme tends to underspend from one year to the next, and there's a carry forward. But I just want to highlight and give you the opportunity to be clear in the room that the capital programme that we're looking at now, with the lines that it contains within it, commits the borrowing, the additional borrowing that this council has under its current appetite for borrowing as far forward as 27-28. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. But again, I would draw your attention back to other documentation. It shows that it's prudent borrowing to deliver services, but it's also much lower than many other councils. It's very much within the guidelines that our auditors would put.
Mr Lovegrove.
Chair, thank you. And the assumption about future borrowing for the 27-28 year is baked into the MTFS, which we'll come on to later. So that is built into the model. It's a very similar approach that was taken a year ago. So the meeting, this Scrutiny Board at the 17th of January 2023 had a table very similar to this. Obviously, it's just rolled forward a year.
Yeah, and the only reason why I'm highlighting it now is because we will return to it in the context of the MTFS and looking at our reserves later on in the meeting. But seeing as we're covering the capital programme now, it's helpful just to set that out so that we can return to it under those other agenda items. So thank you for that. Members, have we got any further questions? We're going to need to keep to time. Councillors, Councillor Stark, will you defer to Councillor Chowns for a moment? Councillor Chowns.
Thanks. It's just a direct follow-up on the issue we've just been discussing about the dragging forward of the borrowing from a previous year. So directly comparing the approach taken last year with the approach taken this year. Last year, it was not assuming that it would take all of the borrowing allocation from 3 years hence and put it in. It was only partly. So what's happening is a ratcheting up of the level of borrowing from the future to the point where there is no capacity left for borrowing in 3 years' time because it's all been pre-allocated in the intervening years. Is that not a somewhat worrying trend, effectively borrowing from ahead of ourselves over and above our annual funding limit?
To reply to that, Councillor, I believe it's prudent because it's factored into the MTFS. So we've got a 4-year plan ahead, so we know what we're factoring in.
But it's factored into the MTFS in the sense that we have an annual funding limit, but the only way that we're nominally staying within that is by saying we'll borrow everything for a 4-year period in the first 3 years, and we'll leave ourselves no capacity to borrow in 4 years' time. That's going to get us into trouble in 4 years' time when we will still be needing to borrow, presumably, for things that people want to do. Should we not be aiming to live within our means from year to year?
Chair, and the approach that you're seeing in front of you is exactly the same as what was adopted a year ago. So a year ago, the budget that was put forward to council was assuming that all of the borrowing within the 4 years was drawn down. So I think factually, that was the position that was here. So what you're seeing in front of you is exactly the same approach. Everything's rolled forward a year, and it's the further 6.7 million.
In addition, Councillor, as you say, we're looking forward, but you mentioned that it may not be fully spent anyway, so we could roll that forward in those future years. I just believe it's very prudent that we have this in place, and in that transparency that we very much in this administration wish to we have adopted and we're taking forward as we are now to show our workings for the future.
Wrong button. Yeah. I take your point, Councillor Stoddart, and your point, Mr Lovegrove. I think the concern is that in the absence of a new county plan, which, you know, all other things being equal, we would have had coming forward alongside this budget to provide the policy and the priority framework within which we could look at the budget. What we're kind of unsighted as to how the next 4 years in terms of county priorities looks with respect to this as a 4-year view of the capital investment programme. Pulling forward funding to enable more capital projects to be started sooner in order to be able to deliver infrastructure and improved community capacity for Herefordshire is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think the points that Councillor Stark and others have made about reviewing this budget in the absence of seeing a county plan which sets out that 4-year view does somewhat fetter our ability to see the context within which this plan is presented.
The challenge is always going to be in that first period, the first year of any administration, especially with the change of administration, is that we are going to be redoing that new county plan. And therefore, I can give you the assurance that we'll deliver it as quickly as we possibly can. As we recall back to the November meeting where we're talking about the future plans for the county plan, I quite agree that we in the perfect world it would have been here. The reality is it's not, but it will be as soon as we can.
Yes, I mean the thing is, when we discussed it in November and we recommended that you maybe rethought your time frame in order to be able to allow some more meaningful time for public consultation, the expectation was that it would slip in terms of coming to council from the budget meeting in February to the council tax setting meeting in March. However, since then, we have been advised that you are, as an administration, not in a position to be able to bring the county plan forward until the annual council meeting in May now. So that's yet a further time slip in being able to provide a county plan to, you know, this committee and to the council more and the county more generally. Now, there's probably very good reasons why that slippage has occurred. However, that's not the position that we were anticipating to begin with. We were hoping when we put our programme together in July that we would have it alongside the budget, and we offered a slippage in order to improve public engagement on this important 4-year plan for the whole county. And we just got a slip again. So I think the committee is sympathetic. However, it is, you know, we're keen that it is acknowledged that it is providing a difficulty to us in looking at this budget, and more generally it is delaying setting out clearly what the priorities are of this present administration. Members, I think in order to try and keep to time, we're going to have to move on to the next agenda item, which is medium-term financial strategy, which we have allowed a bit more time for. We did receive this document late. However, members have considered it over the weekend, and we have a number of lines of inquiry that we'd like to pursue on this. So, starting with Councillor Stark.
I'll refer to a specific paragraph later on, but I just want to raise a general point about the whole governance of this change from the MTFS in 1 year to the MTFS in another year against the context of a changed administration. Chief Exec, what is your role and the CFT's role in terms of overseeing the actual construction of the MTFS when there is a change of administration? I mean, do you actually give a steer to those working on it as to what your priorities might be in terms of, as it can only be, Chair, the existing county plan? Is that how you actually gave a steer in terms of the MTFS for this year, for 24-25? I'm just trying to get an idea of what your role is in it and what the ECLT's role is in it in terms of constructing this MTFS when we only have a county plan to 2024, and therefore we're trying to set an MTFS for way beyond that.
I think, to be fair, in terms of my role as Chief Executive and CLT's role in constructing the MTFS, I suppose in the first instance guided by the Director of Finance in terms of the financial context in which the Council's operating, and the assumptions it will be making in taking that MTFS forward, based on the principles that are set out in the 24-25 budget, and in many respects those things that we know and have been confirmed about future funding. So there's a series of assumptions that we base the MTFS upon. That particular detail, Andrew, as a Director of Finance, is the one who's the guardian of that particular detail. But it is very much around balancing the budget for 24-25, and there's a draft budget proposal that does that, and then taking that forward in terms of an MTFS based on the known assumptions that are being made, and those things that we know are going to happen over the next 3 years, the life of the MTFS, in terms of pressures on the revenue budget and or revenue costs associated with capital developments. And you can see that's been set out. And I think if you look at the detail, and on the basis of the budget that that's been put forward for 24-25, and then the MTFS and the projected funding gap through to 27-28, you can see how those assumptions have come together in terms of the surplus or gap in the forecasted budget over the next 3 years.
So there's no drive from you and your service directors to actually set out what you might think would be a notional budget without having to think about the constraints in finance, that if you wanted to have a certain level of service delivery, for example, and I'll go on to that in terms of the shape of the budget, do you actually have any discussions with, say, your corporate director for E&E saying, what would we like to be actually delivering this year, and what would be the underlying cost for that, and then go back and say to the Director of Finance, this is what we would like to spend, but what are the constraints that you're going to give us in terms of what we can spend?
Through you, Chair. I mean, as I said, in terms of setting out the parameters for the MTFS, they're very much grounded in the 24-25 budget that we've put forward this time. And you'll see kind of the growth that's been put forward within the Economy and Environment Department in terms of additional capacity and resources. The additional funding to support the development of a prospectus for Herefordshire, and also development of funding to provide the development of employment land. So in supporting the opportunities for growth and increasing the level of growth that we would like to see possible, that's baked into this year's budget and will continue to roll forward into future years. I think you've got to see that in terms of the provision for economy and environment in line with the kind of allocations within the capital programme, and the capital programme which has identified the investment in Model Farm, in the Shire Hall and the library and learning facility, and the new developments that are going to come ahead in terms of accommodation at the football club. So I think it's important to see the investment in revenue through the MTFS and the delivery of a capital programme and the growth programme that's been put in place, and the priorities which have been identified. And equally, as you'll see the investment that's coming through in employment land for Model Farm, and in the investment that's coming through in terms of the market towns. It isn't just one piece of work on its own.
Chair, if I can interject as well, so picking up on the C's points. So the capital programme was produced, the revenue budget has been produced, they're linked. The capital, the county plan is in production, and they're all linked, as you know, to growth, investment in our people and infrastructure. So that's the key things that will come through on the county plan.
I accept the logic of what you say, both of you. But if you look at the net revenue budget allocations, and we know they've been going down in terms of E&E, and I really want to understand what sort of constraint that might prove. If you take the corporate allocation as a unit of 1, then adults comes in at 3.1, children's at 2.4, and E&E at 1.1. Now, I accept that on top of that, you might have grant funding, you might have capital investment, but the resources to manage that throughout the year must be impacted by the amount of revenue that we set aside to cover staff costs and skill sets and things like that. So I just feel, Chief Exec, and correct me if I'm wrong, I just feel that the balance of this revenue budget, for whatever reason, is really unfair for most of our residents, because we're putting less and less into the area that most of our residents get the return for the council tax that they pay, which is E&E. Now, I understand the statutory constraints, but really we have to ask ourselves how we have got into a position where a 24/5 revenue budget has adults at 3.1, children's at 2.4, E&E at just over 1.1, and with corporate almost the same size as E&E. I mean, that's my concern, Chair. Thank you.
Councillor, I appreciate your comments, and a lot of your frustration that you share is shared on this side of the table as well. But it's a statutory requirement of what we have to provide. That's what we have to do, and there is no option. There's statutory services, adult and children's. Economy and environment certainly, as some aspects of it are statutory, but some are discretionary, and therefore that's unfortunately what we have to then look at. That was part of the Herculean discussions that we had all the way through from August onwards as we were looking to put this 24-25 budget together, and we had many comments where frustration was shared, and my cabinet colleague on my left was saying, well, but we have to provide this. It's not optional. We have to do it.
Chief Executive.
Yeah, I think we need to remind ourselves of the success of the council in securing external funding, whether it's the Stronger Towns funding which has come into Hereford City as a whole, or whether it's the Levelling Up funding that's coming in terms of the Active Travel Initiative, or whether it's a more recent announcement, through Network North and the additional funding which is coming in to support our highways budget. So it isn't just about the council's funding as a whole, it is about external funding sitting alongside the capital programme aligned to delivering those corporate priorities. And I think also in terms of the work we do, as we did last Friday, when we met the Chair and Chief Executive of Midlands Connect and Midlands Engine to set out the priorities that we have across Herefordshire and how with their support we can move quicker and faster in terms of delivering those. And I think one needs to bear in mind that with those capital initiatives and those capital sums comes an allocation for the delivery of those projects in terms of the programme management arrangements. So that's built into that particular budget programme. I think for the first time in a number of years, we're now having a further investment in the E&E Directorate with additional capacity and resource going in to support the development of the growth initiative. And we need to kind of make sure we spend that money well and get the very best of that alongside delivering the prospectus and the development of employment land across the county. So I think there's a lot to be played for. I think equally we'd all want to do more, but I think equally it's about living within our means and delivering an ambitious programme both through revenue, capital and external funding that's also supported by government.
Cabinet Member.
Thank you, Chair. Picking up on the C's point there, Councillor Stark, it's the revenue budget we've put together is a balanced budget. It's something that we can be very. It's a draft. Sorry, but the draft revenue budget we put together, which is still still engaging in discussion and consultation, but it's a balanced budget. it's achievable. It's achievable because the cabinet members and the directors of each of the services together, working together, have assured that we can provide those savings in that budget, in that revenue budget to do that. Moving on to the MTFS, we've got an MTFS that looks out over 4 years that actually shows a positive step. And finally, we'd like to be looking at potentially this next coming year, we'll then be looking to put some money back into reserves, which is something that we have not done for a considerable period of time. So I agree with your point that we're constrained on what we have to put into our revenue budget, but there is some good news here, and that, looking around the rest of the country, is actually something that's pretty unique. So I think it's something to be celebrated and congratulate ourselves on. Thank you.
Leader.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I concur with the comments that have been made, but my take on it, Councillor Stark, and I remember you and I were at scrutiny meetings in previous years, and you eloquently made the point in previous years that less and less was being spent on the environment and on the economy, whilst the other budgets continued to grow. There's two comments I would say in reference to that this time round. When I don't find myself in scrutiny, I find myself putting forward a budget. And one of the things I learned as a ward member is that every time you talk to members of the public, they were very concerned about the lack of more investment in roads. So that we put forward the capital programme to put forward much more investment in road resurfacing. So the environment is getting substantial amounts of investment. And I think that's a really positive thing that we should really focus on and be grateful for, because that was the way that most of us felt we should go, and that's a great investment. And that's on top of the investment that will be spent this year on what they call service dressing. But the other issue to really grapple with is children's services, and really fund that improvement plan. We're a year into that, but we can't look back now, which is why there's a significant more investment in children's services in this budget. But the strategy for that is to invest that money so that in times to come, when we have a better service that's more stable and even and achieving the things that we wanted to achieve, rather than reacting to improvement and crisis mode, if I can say that, is funding a service that we want to pay for because it's the size and the shape it should be given the requirements of children's services. So extra investment there, but I would not want to see extra investment. It's got to be within a time frame that meets with the improvement plan. That's the goal, that's the strategy. So there's extra investment there, which is making it eclipse economy and environment. But as I say, there is investment in environment and economy through the capital programme. And of course, we want that improvement plan to stick so that we don't have to keep increasing the amounts we spend on children's services. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. If I could turn for a minute to Annex B to the MTFS, which is on page 13 of the supplement that was published to the agenda papers. This is a useful table in terms of summarising where we think the money's coming from and what we think our expenditure top level lines are going to be, looking ahead 4 years. Now, one of the things that was flagged in the medium-term financial strategy last year was that without management action, there would be something like a £16 million gap over looking ahead 4 years in terms of where the income was coming from. However, what also happened was a recommendation went to full council that this council give the 12 months notice, statutory notice, that was required in order to put into place a council tax premium on second homes. Now, the downstream income that is derived from that is able to be recognised in this table here, and across the 3 years that the table is showing it coming in, it's a little over £19 million that we anticipate being able to generate through applying that second homes premium. Now that effectively more than closes the £16 million gap, that because council hadn't taken the decision yet to go ahead with giving notice of that premium, those figures could not be included in the MTFS that was published last year. So now we're looking at there being a gap of some £2 million, £1.9 million, looking across the 4 years, which is a much improved position. But it is very much predicated on that second homes premium and the prediction that we have in terms of the revenue to be generated from that being able to be realised. Now, we're not anticipating that coming in until 25-26. However, we have seen slippage in terms of some of the other income changes that this table anticipates. For example, the social care support grant is extending an extra year compared to the MTFS last year, and the revenue, it being rolled into the revenue support grant, is not now anticipated until 26-27. Now, are those figures the consequence of updated information that we've got from government in terms of when those changes in terms of our funding are going to take effect? Or is this just an updated prediction that we're making ourselves on the matter?
So I'll defer across to Mr. Glover to respond.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. The settlement, we had the draft settlement, because it's still only a draft settlement from government just before Christmas, is a one-year settlement. I'm conscious, I think this is the 5th or 6th year we've had a one-year settlement from government. So, as we've discussed before, the MTFS, the future years, there has to be an element of a informed decision, an estimate based on what the information that we're receiving from the civil servants and our retained experts. So what you're seeing in the table Annex B is that forward projection of where people we're being advised and the information we've had from civil servants. As you can see, that assumes various things about grants and then being combined into a combined revenue support grant rather than the individual grants. So that's based on our best advice at the moment. It is an estimate. In years 2, 3, 4 of an MTFS, by definition, have to be an estimate in the absence of a further and only a one-year settlement.
Okay,
sorry, just on the point of the second homes arrangement. A year ago, the Levelling Up Act it's still a bill and it was still in draft. We've now had, since last October, it has become an act, so the legislation has been passed, which will enable that to be implemented, and as Council, as you said last year, agreed the policy to implement it. So there'll be a further paper coming to the Council meeting on the 9th of February, asking Council to reaffirm its commitment to that policy.
Well, that's good to hear, but you know, given the importance of that new income stream in terms of closing the gap that is highlighted. Presumably there is activity that is going to need to take place in the coming year in order to be able to realise that income the following year.
Chair, there's an awful lot of activity that, as you can imagine, is going on behind the scenes, and we're talking to other councils affected by this, so North Yorkshire, Cornwall, the Lakes, on there. It's a national issue to go through and identify which properties meet the definition of second homes. And at the moment, those people own those properties don't have to tell us they're second homes, so we're waiting for the guidance to go through. We're also working through our own arrangements, how we as a council, through our collection service, will identify those properties and what steps we'll put into place to identify people that maybe aren't telling us the full truth, if that's the politest way of putting it, and making sure that we collect the right amount of tax.
Well, it's good to hear that we're in a position to be able to make progress on that, because do we have a plan B if this income doesn't come to fruition, in terms of where we'd be looking to deliver the income to narrow that gap? Or are all our eggs in this basket?
Chair, it is a form of taxation, so if council reaffirms its policy to charge for second homes, it becomes a legally tax that has to be charged for, and as officers we have to collect. So in terms of the arrangements, if the property and the way it's owned and the way it's operated meets the definition, the tax is due, and we will ensure that we collect the tax through our normal processes as we do any other element of the council tax or business rates.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's cross our fingers and toes in terms of getting the vote the right way from council. Hopefully we don't change our minds on that, and that our forecasts in terms of what we're expecting to get in terms of second home ownership in the county actually come to fruition. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I think some of the questions that I've got are very much around the identification of the financial risks in the medium-term financial strategy for our budget, because obviously the ability to recognise and mitigate risk gives the credence and assurance that the figures themselves are correct. So the first thing that did alarm me was when we had the risks that came with the original draft budget on the 10th of January. As I pointed out at the time, we had a rather alarming phrase under not delivering the inquired improvements in children's, which is on the original pack, page 18, which had a 3-year strategic and financial plan has been developed to ensure the Children and Young People's Directorate is able to live within its means after 3 years, has now been changed in table 4 to able to deliver current servings over a 3-year period. So that's my first thing. So my concern then is we've looked at an awful lot of papers last week, and now I'm seeing changes which I wouldn't have expected to have seen in tables that I would have thought would have been. Is that me or you? I also note in that table now we have a further risk under dedicated schools grant, which wasn't there before, and I understand Councillor Fagan's probably got some questions that she wants to ask about this. And my third point is that I want to make again this week, under the heading for interest, under the heading for potential overspend and non-delivery of savings. We're just talking about the high-risk budget areas. We have such a major programme of transformation and Thrive, which we'll be coming on to when we look at the corporate budget. My questioning is why, if we've got a large amount of money and transformation riding on a particular project, why isn't it specifically mentioned in there? But these are my main points. I find that the changes that have been made to a table that I would have expected to be pretty much a mirror image of itself doesn't fill me with confidence that you know, the papers are just changing every time we see them.
Councillor Bartlett, thank you. First of all, you mentioned that you hope the figures are correct. What I can give you the assurance that the financial team, the figures are as best as they can be based on the current information available to them today. Because anything like an MTFS is a projection, and we don't know what will happen in the future. It's based on good practice. As I said before, Herefordshire Council have been congratulated for their governance and the level of their detail from Grant Thornton. Moving on to the point about the updated documents, I believe it was updated following discussion last week to make sure it's most current and up to date. I'll pass across to...
In that case, why were we given no track changes document or any pointers to say what has changed?
Thank you. The document that you referred to last week was the financial risk table in the draft revenue budget for 24-25. This table refers to the MTFS financial risks. There are two changes, as you've pointed out. The first change is to clarify the point that you raised last week. And when we present these documents to Cabinet on the 25th, they will include some updates as well to reflect the outcome of the public and online consultations and the final settlement that was received in December. So there will be updates to these and we will make you aware of those. But the DSG risk is in reference to the statutory override that ends in the medium-term financial period, not in the 24-25 revenue budget. So it's to expand on the risks that are relevant over the medium term.
Chair, do we need track changes then if we're going through three meetings or three scenarios at different pages?
Yeah, I think it's important that as the picture becomes clearer, that officers are working hard to give us the most up-to-date picture, and I think that is to be commended, and we appreciate that, and we'd expect that you know the latest picture is provided. I think track changes helps to identify where those changes are in what is quite a complex pack of documentation. And I think for members and for the public, being able to have some version control in terms of updates would be helpful in order to keep everybody on the, you know, on point in terms of the most up-to-date information. I don't know how difficult that is to achieve, but if it is achievable, it would be much appreciated, and I think it would be helpful for the public and for members. Mr. Lovegrove.
Chair, thank you. I'm very happy to look at the track changes, and as we said, that will appear in the Cabinet paper. But this is the first time you've seen this document. It is different to the revenue budget document, so there isn't a. I don't think we do a track changes because this is the first time you've seen it.
Yeah, that's understood. That's understood. Thank you. Leader.
Yes, thank you. On the bit that Councillor Bartlett has read as it being different, but she hasn't seen this document before, I think officers were trying to reflect on your comments about living within its means didn't really encapsulate properly the sentiment of what was trying to be achieved by that sentence. So when it came to do the MTFS, that thought process was taken on board. So, you know, it was really useful feedback at the time, so that when we come to phrase this matter here, it goes back to the point I was making earlier about our ambition for children's services is to have that level of expenditure and investment that is appropriate to a council our size with the challenges we face, rather than having a service that we're paying extra for because it's in need of improvement. So, you know, if there's another way of articulating that sentiment, then it'd be really helpful to hear that as well. Thank you.
Thanks. And if we could turn to the planning assumptions in the MTFS and the table that you've got in terms of key assumptions by budget area. The inflation assumptions that you've got for contract inflation for the council seem to be broadly mirroring the predictions that are out there for inflation generally, the CPI type inflation. Previously, we've been told that the way that inflation hits the kind of services that the council delivers isn't necessarily well matched to the shopping basket way in which the CPI is constructed. We were making an assumption last year, which actually in a bigger version of the MTFS than we have before us now, and I know that officers have tried to slim the document down in order to make it a bit more understandable and a bit more focused, but inevitably it loses some of that detail as a consequence. We were actually showing how inflation hit our different directorates and service areas differently, and then providing an overall kind of average position that took into account all of those differences, and some of them were quite stark, you know, sort of into double figures for inflation in hitting in some areas, partly because of when the contracts are up for renegotiation and that sort of thing. So I'm just wondering whether there's any comment to be made on why you're choosing to make the assumptions in terms of future years really kind of mirroring CPI rather than taking that rather more nuanced approach that we had in the MTFS last year.
Pick up on your point, Chair, about the impact of inflation. Having gone through that process with all the Star Chambers and with the various cabinet colleagues, the impact of inflation, as you say, it varies. So CPI is dropping down, but we've got hangover inflation because we've set the contract rates previously. And that had a significant impact when we then looked at the derivation of this year's revenue budget. But we had to then incorporate that, including then in addition the real-time living wage, because although we don't pay that, we pay more than that, some of the contracts we're using do include that, so we had to include that into our revenue budget as well. So that was two of the factors that actually were a challenge for us as we put together this year's revenue budget. I'll now turn to Mr. Oliver to address your issue about the rate of inflation that we've chosen.
Okay, thank you. Chair, as you mentioned, a year or so ago, we were quite nervous about what inflation will be. We've been through that inflation cycle on there. There is a school of thought, I'm not sure whether I subscribe to it, but the construction side of things is actually slowing down at a quicker rate than people were expecting to the CPI measures. So there is some evidence that because of the slowdown in the housing market, there is surplus capacity in the construction industry, both in terms of labour and material as we look forward for the next 18 months. Sorry on those arrangements. So what you're seeing here, that we are mirroring broadly with CPI on the basis that that's a balance where you quite rightly say CPI measures, which is a basket more of household goods, tend to be not the sort of things we buy, but it's a good proxy at the moment for those inflations. Otherwise, we could, the argument is we were having lower rate of inflation, which is probably not the prudent thing to do. So it is quite a difficult challenge to predict forward for inflation.
Okay, but the inflation assumptions that we've got here are very different from the ones that we had in the MTFS last year. They're rather more optimistic than our inflation assumptions last year. And given that inflation has, you know, an immediate effect on, you know, our purchasing on a daily basis, I'm just kind of wanting some assurance that this more optimistic profile in terms of the assumptions for future years is robust.
I'm happy to. My view is that this is a robust set of assumptions, and the world has moved on significantly. I know it's only 12 months ago, but we've been through an inflation cycle. If you recall, a year ago, we were very concerned that inflation would actually be a multi-year arrangement. It's a smaller arrangement. we've taken expert advice as well into supporting this, and we have done some sensitivity analysis, so I'm comfortable it's a reasonable assumption for inflation. The only way of really knowing is in a year's time when we look back and see how we performed. Indeed.
I mean, I did have a look at the council tax base going back to 2017, 2018, to take a look at whether a 1% uplift year on year was reasonable, and it jolly well is. So, you know, despite everything that's been going on since back then, COVID and floods and problems with our river systems, etc. You know, 1% does seem to be a prudent assumption when it comes to uplifting our council tax base, alongside even the continuation of the 100% council tax discount for the hardest up households. So, you know, that was good to test, and good to see that you know, that's a positive that we can build into our assumptions, and you know, pleased to see that. Before I go to Councillor Stark, who's indicated, just a comment on fees and charges. Back in November at the SMB meetings where we looked at income and charging, we did request that there was detail provided as part of the budget work to actually show where the income is in detail against the service areas across the council, given the statements that we're making about how income and charging is becoming an increasingly important part of how we balance our budget. And I'd like to ask, well, we haven't had that information, and it was something that we reminded officers of when we had the meeting last week. Neither have we had the information specifically that we requested back in November and last week about the tie-up between the net income derived from car parking and the very specific range of public realm and transport related services that income supports the delivery of in year, and how you propose to manage that dynamically in order to neither over-deliver on income or overspend on the provision of those services, which is supported by dynamically by the car parking income which is collected. I know car parking is a very emotive subject for our residents, and it's important, I think, that we demonstrate how we use that income in order to support transport services and public realm and highway maintenance services, which you know, either support or offset the impact that cars have on our road networks moving around, or give people alternatives to using the car. So can I please ask again that information is provided ahead of the papers going to Cabinet and to full council, so that we can see where the income assumptions are at service level across this budget.
Thank you, Chair. The request is acknowledged, and currently officers are working on it, so we should be able to provide that for you in the timeline that you've requested.
Thank you. Councillor Stark.
Thank you, Chair. I've been too quiet for too long, obviously. I want to go back to Annex B in the MTFS, please. Chair, you've already mentioned the funding side, but what concerns me is the expenditure side and some of the assumptions I made there. Can I just start with Children's Services invisible savings this year, which is now shown as a dash for 23-24, which represented 9% of the budget when it was originally put forward. Can I ask the Chief Exec whether he and his CLT team get monthly reports from the programme board, if it does meet monthly, Councillor Powell, about assurances on what has happened to these savings and about the general transformation that needs to happen? Because, Chair, we have then for 3 years beyond that, another 10 million savings that we've got to take at face value here, but which we haven't got any track record that they've been achieved in the past. That's my first question. And then I'll go on to a general question about savings, and then the demand and pressure side, if that's all right.
Through you, Chairman, in terms of the role of CLT and myself and the Director of Finance in terms of monitoring progress against savings, yes, there is a monthly report that comes to CLT, which is scrutinised by CLT as a team in terms of the delivery of savings in year, and also the delivery of the budget to live within the means of it for each directorate, and that happens on a monthly basis. In addition to that, there have been weekly budget review meetings between myself and the Director of Finance and the respective corporate director. And in addition to that, over the last 3 months, there have been regular star chambers, as we call them, involving the cabinet member to do two things. One is to have a close range look at the in-year performance, delivery of savings, the reasons why that's not happening and where it is, and also the ability to deliver within the means of the overall budget. And secondly, at those meetings, to look at the proposals for the 24-25 budget, both in terms of savings to be achieved, the unfunded pressures, which have been identified by corporate directors that are needed to deliver the service within a particular area, and the mitigations to how we might deliver those. So I have to say there is quite a full programme of eyes-on financial performance, both on a close range basis with myself, the Director of Finance and the respective corporate director at a corporate leadership team level, and at a star chamber with the respective cabinet members, and that happens the same for each of those areas. In children's service, I think the particular detail around the delivery of savings that were identified for both placement management and recruitment and retention has been gone into in some detail with the respective director and colleagues from the finance team, and I wasn't expecting to go through that particular detail, but the eyes on and my role as chief executive and the political leadership is certainly happening. And we are as concerned as all in terms of where we are. As was said at the scrutiny meeting, we need to take account of what's happening in terms of the wider context of children's services and the ability of all the other service areas across the council to kind of live within their means and the cash limited budget and deliver the savings that have been set out within the overall budget in year, so we minimise the pressure going into the 24-25 budget.
Can I continue, Chair, with this line of questioning?
Yes, and then after you, it's Councillor Crockett.
Yeah, I'll try not to be too long then. We have total savings beyond the Children's Services Directorate of 20 million, or at least savings and mitigations. I don't know whether that will be transformation Annex B, which then rises to 24 million, Chief Exec, in 24-25. That is quite a high number in terms of the overall budget. What sort of actions does the CLT take in order to ensure in year that if there is slippage in savings, what adjustments or changes in direction can be made? Because it seems to me that with a total of 26 million plus in 24-25, I'd be very much surprised if that was achieved based on the track record we've had so far.
I think if you look at the track record so far, whether that's the track record which has been verified recently by Grant Thornton in their annual audit, and the Council's ability to deliver on its savings programme and to provide the auditable plans which set out how those savings are to be achieved, which has been externally recognised as kind of a strength of the local authority, or the work of individual corporate directors who, if they're not able to deliver savings in one particular area because of circumstances, then they'll look to find savings in other areas. You know, the fundamental challenge for me as Chief Executive with corporate directors if circumstances have changed and we're not able to deliver a particular line on the savings programme, then what else can be done to allow those savings to be achieved? And I think you will need to acknowledge that in the current year, not all of the savings have been achieved as per the original savings programme, and things change, and sometimes that happens. But all of the areas, except for children's services, you know, we are fully committed to those savings, the level of savings that are required to be delivered, and that those directors will live within their bottom line. That is our strategy for in year and achieving that position in year. And from the monitoring meetings that we have, both on an individual basis and through the corporate leadership team, you know, we fully expect that to happen unless something significantly changes.
Thank you, Chief Executive. I mean, it is a massive caveat that you put on what you say by saying excluding children's services, because actually it's children's services that are the really big problem here. You know, with 0 of their savings proposed for this year actually being delivered, despite assurances being provided to this committee this time last year that delivery plans were in place for all the savings that were being proposed as part of the budget. And, you know, it seems clear that service areas, certainly throughout the entirety of this financial year, have not provided feedback on what their plans are for delivering those savings. And those savings are exactly the same savings areas that are proposed to deliver £2.5 million worth of savings in the coming financial year as part of delivering a balanced budget for this council, with 0 track record demonstrated in terms of the performance reports for this financial year that any of the savings are in the process of being delivered this year, to give credibility and confidence that the savings proposed for next year, albeit at a lower level, are indeed achievable.
Chair, if I can interject here, that as you say, so this year's budget, which is of course your previous administration's budget that we're delivering this year, when you were on this side of the chair, delivering to Scrutiny, I believe it was cabinet members that gave the assurance that those savings were able to be made. The difference that we believe in next year's budget is that, as I said earlier, it's not just the cabinet member that's giving the assurance and that confidence. We have the direct agreement with those directors to deliver it. And as I say, not only it's this year's savings have been made apart from children's services because of the challenges that we're experiencing with that. The directors have made this year all of the savings that your budget put in place.
Yeah, well, when cabinet members come to scrutiny, they don't come and just shoot from the hip themselves personally, spouting off opinions. Those assurances were provided as a consequence of themselves having been assured by exactly the same officers that are assuring you that those savings were deliverable. Those assurances were provided last year also. And it is exactly as a consequence of that that I and other members are concerned for this council that the assurances that you are receiving are deliverable, are going to come to fruition. Everybody was genuine and sincere last year in terms of making those assurances, with exactly the same kinds of caveats in terms of, you know, risks that were flagged then and are being flagged now, but are, you know, as far as the in-year savings are concerned, are being flagged as the reasons why 0 of those savings are being delivered, and without any track record in terms of what you're forecasting as the outturn for the end of this financial year. 0 savings being delivered. Where is the assurance? Where is the evidence? Where is the confidence that we can be provided with that you're going to deliver significant savings by the end of Q1 in terms of flipping staff from, for example, agency to permanent workforce. You know, just as one example, and we know how difficult that is to achieve in reality. So, you know, our job is based on bitter experience going back more than just this year, but into last year and the year before. Everybody's hopes, expectations and, you know, assurances have not come to fruition for this particular directorate, whereas the other directorates, as a consequence, have to tighten their belts still further to offset the inability of this directorate to be able to make the progress at the pace that we all hope.
So picking up on your points, as you just said, all this year's budget, all directorates, less children's services, have made the savings that they are accredited to. The situation within children's is unique, it's challenging, and that's why this administration will look to give additional funding for next year for to fund the 3-year plan, because we believe confidently that that directorate will make those savings.
But dealing with that structural deficit, as your papers put it, is effectively on the back of requiring even greater savings from other parts of the council to be delivered in order to move that money around and put it on the children's budget line. Now, you know, that may be the reality of the situation, but effectively what you're doing is front loading what has been the overspend this year, which we'll come to when we look at the reserves in terms of quite exactly where that money is going to come from to fill that that shortfall this year, because it isn't clear. But we'll come to that under discussing the reserves. But as far as next year's concerned, you're making a structural adjustment to the budget for children's, rationalising that as being something that they can then manage in terms of their pressures and delivery of savings over the next 3 years, without there being any evidence provided through financial forecasting at all that savings are in the process of being made now.
First thing I would say, Chair, is that children's services in this council are not unique to any other council. Having at the CCN conference in November, our overspend on children's services of 10 million was quite insignificant in comparison to some of the other councils that we were speaking with. So we're not unique. It's not a unique situation. All councils in the land are seeking additional funding for children's services. What I can say to you is that by as the leader has alluded to many times, the number one priority for this administration is children's services. And that's why we're having sat down, looked at the delivery plan, the action plan that's in place. We as a cabinet are confident, having discussed with all of the officers that they can make those savings over the 3 years, that we will provide them that additional funding so that by the end of the 3rd year in 27-28, they are then in a position that they are living within the budget that's set.
But your own monthly cabinet reports on this directorate are not providing you with any evidence to substantiate the confidence that you're expressing in the room here before us all. I've got the leader and I've got the cabinet member indicating.
Yes,
and, you know, I'll call the leader and then the cabinet member.
Thank you, Chair. With respect, I think you're forgetting what Mr. Freeman's contribution was last week, and he was giving clear examples of where there were steps being taken in terms of the improvement that was leading directly to savings, and we'd have to play the tape back, but there were a cohort of social workers that had converted from agency to permanent. So that was one of his key examples of where savings are being made, but savings stroke improvements are being made, and that was evidence, and so it's a whole complex picture, and I wouldn't go into any detail, but there's an example. We can get you more examples if you feel that there's this uneasiness about how to deliver. I think the position is different to last year in that the improvement plan had started. You were the pioneers in your last administration of getting the improvement plan off the ground. We're moving forward with that now, and that's giving us a basis in which to claim that we're going to make further savings and improvements, which will drive down budgetary pressures. So it's there, but if you need a more detailed list of that, then maybe that's the type of recommendation that you could put to the cabinet to give you those key examples that you're after.
Yeah, I thank you, Leader, and committee members recall the examples that and assurances that Mr. Freeman provided to us last week. However, that's not evidence because it's not translating into savings that are actually being recognised in the performance reports that your administration is making public. Now, if you're not prepared to actually declare those savings as evidence and track record of a movement in the right direction, all the words in the world aren't actually providing us with evidence and assurance, simply assertions. Cabinet Member.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, apologies, I couldn't make last week's meeting, so I didn't hear the Director of Children's Services input to the meeting, but I am obviously very familiar with many of those issues that would have been rehearsed in that discussion. And apologies for being late today. I had a safeguarding partnership meeting elsewhere. So I don't want to do too much detail here, but I do want to just also remind us that there are 6 areas that the Commissioner has identified that she would want to see the improvement programme include and be the subject of report in 6 months' time. They have been shared with Councillor Fagan as oh. Lost me? Yeah, back. So they are with Children's Scrutiny for consideration. I have detailed discussions with the Director and have recently had a conversation with Rachel to make sure that we're triangulating the delivery of improved outcomes for children, which include demand reduction across a range of areas that will translate across. The Children's Safeguarding Partnership also have a significant role to play in this, so I'll just give you a couple of examples, and I don't want to extend the debate unnecessarily. In Herefordshire, we have a rate of looked after children which is higher than you would expect for a local authority of this size, and recognising that the challenges that children and young people face in a county of the nature of Herefordshire. When you start to get into the detail of that, and I do, what we see is a significant amount of referral into the local authority front door by agencies, an amount of that transferring into no further action, so there's inefficiency there in the system. And it is a fact that when you have a local authority that is inadequate and subject to such an improvement plan, agencies are more nervous about circumstances that they come across when they're encountering children and young people. So there's a significant uplift in increases of referrals, and that is translating into an increased number of Section 47 strategy discussions, an increased number of child protection plans, which ultimately end up being closed quite soon after they're instigated. Now, that is very definitely a conversation that the Children's Safeguarding Partnership need to be having, because each of the principal agencies in those discussions need to be challenging each other about, is that the right decision? Is that likely to lead to the right outcome for children, young people and families? So the director has reported on those significant issues around recruitment and retention, looked after children rates, because that's where the higher cost placements are, and indeed the pressure on the special educational needs and disabilities transport budget, and that links to the work that's ongoing to improve placement sufficiency for a range of children. So the whole range of stuff that is going on. That
Cabinet member,
focuses
I'm
on-
sorry to interrupt
Yeah.
you, but I mean, the top and bottom of it is, as far as budget scrutiny is concerned, and I'm sure children and young people's scrutiny is going to be happy to go into the detail of all of this, but as far as budget scrutiny is concerned, the top and tail of it is, are you going to be able to demonstrate a track record of starting to deliver savings in your portfolio area before the end of this financial year, and in advance of approving this budget through Cabinet and offering it up to full council, so that there can be some assurance provided that there is a trajectory and evidence of delivery from this directorate that can substantiate delivery of and give confidence to delivery of the £2.5 million worth of savings that are creating the balance in this budget for next financial year.
So we're happy that we've done the detailed working out that will enable us to do that.
So your Q3 performance report is going to show savings starting to be delivered in your directorate that will be being acknowledged and will be being banked as part of an adjustment to your forecast of outturn.
Well, we're happy that we've got the right metrics in place to be able to do that, and we'll only know if we're doing that by reporting against those metrics, won't we? I can't forecast what the future's going to be. What we forecasted is what the future ought to be along the journey of an improvement plan.
It's not the future anymore. Accounting period 9 has closed. Are you going to be acknowledging and forecasting that you have banked and delivered, you will be, by the 31st of March 2024, savings against your savings lines in this financial year, to provide evidence of delivery to support and justify savings that you've got in your budget for next year?
I can't answer that without speaking directly to the director, because we've not had that discussion yet. So, the commitment is that we understand the direction of travel, the detail of the conversation we need, and, I'll report back to this committee.
If you are unable to provide evidence of delivery, track record of delivery this financial year, it severely calls into question the safety of balancing our budget based on an assumption that you will deliver savings next year that you have not demonstrated the capacity to deliver in any way, shape or form this year.
Well, forgive me, my understanding is the reason that we're putting forward the budget proposal we are is that it's been acknowledged that the savings projections that were due to be delivered in this current financial year were not going to be achievable.
But Mr. Freeman last week said that the appointments that have been made and the changes in the staff mix that have been made will be impacting during Q4.
So, yes, they will be, but I don't have the detail of that right now. So I can't honestly answer the question without being able to defer to the director to understand that. But what we're talking about is the delivery of a 3-year plan starting the next financial year, rather than what the legacy was of this financial year, acknowledging that, generally speaking, the majority of savings that were projected have been acknowledged as not being able to be delivered in this financial year.
Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chairman. I think Darryl, when he was here last week, and Councillor Powell, and neither Councillor Powell or I were here last week, so, just thinking back to the debrief that Darryl Freeman gave us was around the assurance about delivery that he provided to the Task and Finish Group previously around delivery of savings for 24-25, and the evidence and the trajectory you're commenting on in the final quarter of this year will be borne out by the number of appointments that have started to be made to convert those staff which are currently employed on an interim or an agency basis into permanent members of staff. And what we haven't got in front of us is that level of detail of how many have been confirmed in recent weeks and how many are due to be confirmed in the coming weeks. That's a point of detail that I understood had come through from Darryl in terms of the Task and Finish Group. But that's where the assurance will come in, that those conversions are starting to be made so that the workforce savings which have been identified in 3 years plan can show that there's a move towards those. And at the same time, you know, the reduction in cost of those high cost placements and also the number of children who are planned to be reunited with their families, which will ultimately go to reduce the demand costs for children who are in care. So at Q3, yes, we hope to be able to show those trajectories, particularly around recruitment. That's predicated on the appointments being made in time for the Q3 cut-off report being done. But I am confident that the detailed work that's been done to support the delivery of savings in year one of the 3-year plan, as evidenced by Darryl and the finance colleagues to the Task and Finish Group, supports the integrity of the plan, the commitment there is to deliver those savings, and that we'll start to see the evidence of that, subject to those appointments being made before the Q3 cut-off in the Q3 report.
Thank you, Chief Executive. Well, I think it's that kind of evidence that upon which a recommendation from this committee will pivot as to whether or not we consider it to be safe to be balancing our budget around the £2.5 million worth of savings proposed to be delivered next year by Children's. Councillor Crockett and then Councillor Fagan.
Thank you, Chair. Right, I want to skip back a couple of issues, actually. This council is committing to ensure residents have a clear understanding of council business, especially and most importantly where residents' purses are involved, for example, council tax. We, this council, are striving to have an abbreviation and acronym-free dialogue and crystal clear language in our documents. Therefore, could I ask that authors continue with our aim? Chair, you mentioned the planning assumptions on this MTFS document, and if you go to 4.1, table 2, an example of that is where it states about council tax. I'm not going to read it, but I would ask everybody to read it because I had to read it several times before I made any sense of it. So it's just so that the residents and general public understand things in a clear form, please. Any comments would be welcome. Don't know whether Rachel, you want to comment?
Chair, can I mention, so is it the council tax which an increase of 4.99 is assumed? Is it that one?
Yeah.
Yes, I think the confusion is around there being percentages quoted within that that box that relate to two separate things. One to do with the council tax base, which is the number of properties against which council tax is chargeable in a year, and the other one being the percentages associated with future years' council tax uplift assumptions that are built into the plan. And I think it's just that we've got two lots of percentages that happen to add up to almost the 5% that we've got in this current year.
Through you, Chair. Yeah, we'll take that on board and we'll try to clarify that and separate out those two items, the increase in council tax and the increase in council tax base, to make it clearer for users.
Councillor Fagan.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. Just to go back to the issue about children's services, and as I raised last week with Mr. Freeman, was about the risk of not delivering the required improvements. And that was put as low, and the impact of that medium, where actually you know, based on the evidence that we've been discussing, it seems we are not entirely confident. And I think part of the reason for that is because we haven't seen the evidence. And so what I would really, a lot of that, the 3-year plan relies on the conversion of agency staff to council employed staff, full-time staff. And are we absolutely confident that we have the data in terms of staffing levels from the service that actually supports that assertion? And if we don't have that data in front of us, I think what we will need is as a council to see that data and to be absolutely sure that the service is on top of that data, because there's, I think the concern about it is that we aren't being presented with that data, and that is what we need to see. So if we are thinking of a recommendation, I think we need to be absolutely sure that the accuracy around the staffing is there, and that if there are some concerns about how that is being monitored, that we put in place some pretty stringent controls around that, or if need be, additional resources in terms of that, the collection of that data, so that we are absolutely on top of that. So there's no discrepancy whatsoever around who is agency staff, who is council employed staff. I think it's absolutely key to the delivery of the successful delivery of this plan.
Chief Executive.
Thank you. And I think that's a fair suggestion. I would expect that, based on what you said, to be a recommendation that comes out of the Task and Finish group. And those monitoring reports are provided as we go through the year, you know, to confirm the conversion of agency and interim staff to permanent is happening against the profile, and that level of saving is being realised. So I think that would be a good, almost a good and right recommendation to come through to ensure what the Directorate was saying is going to happen is happening throughout the year.
Chair, if I can just say, because the Task and Finish report is actually going to come to the Children's Scrutiny Committee, so potentially that's something that we'll need to just make sure of next week when this Children's Scrutiny Committee meets.
Yeah, well, it will come to the committee, and you'll be able to take your view on that then. Right, I think from a timing point of view, unless there are any other burning questions on the MTFS, we need to move on to the corporate budget and cover what we weren't able to cover off on last week. Is everybody content that we do that? Could I just check? Councillor Thomas has joined us remotely, and Councillor Thomas, I'm conscious it's not always easy to indicate when you're attending a meeting remotely. Are there any questions associated with the things that we've been discussing under the MTFS that you would like to raise before we leave the item?
I think you covered most of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move to corporate then, and thank you for being able to be with us, Councillor Stoddart, to be able to cover this item. We've got a number of questions, as you would hope and expect, associated with the information to do with corporate, particularly because you also seem to be holding responsibility for some fairly bold savings associated with council-wide activity. But we'll deal to begin with the corporate-specific aspects of the slide stack that you provided to the 10th of January meeting. So committee members, if who'd like to start with a line of inquiry on corporate? Councillor Fagan, and then Councillor Chowns.
It was just really a question about why the corporate budget is carrying the legal costs for the children's services.
It's a legal service activity, and legal services sit under corporate, so that's why it sits there.
Okay, I think the difficulty is that actually it's not for me. It doesn't then reflect the activity that's happening in terms of the legal activity that's happening in terms of children's services. It's not sort of properly sort of reflected under that budget, under the children's budget. But I'll accept. I'll accept your response for now. Thank you.
I think there's a slightly broader point in that, in terms of the project management office, there are some overspends there, and there's also legal services spending in supporting, quite appropriately, work in a service area. And the question is really whether corporate services is holding costs that are associated with service delivery in the directorate areas, whether it's for the employment of interims who are actually working in the service areas, or indeed not having things that are going on in legal being cross-charged to the service area where the benefit is delivered. Now, I know there's an argument that says in local government our finances, we're not going to play shopkeepers and be cross-charging expenses here and there, but on the other hand, it does obscure the actual cost of delivery of services. And if it's a short-term thing, in terms of an interim placement or whatever, that's one thing. But if it's a long-term thing, just raising, as Councillor Fagan did, whether it is appropriate for those costs to be captured in corporate when actually they fall in terms of benefit in a service area.
Ultimately, you're correct that the cost will fall to the individual corporate, the individual service area. It's my understanding that there's temporary funding held within corporate because it's, for example, the PMO. I seem to recall last time I looked at it, there was £600,000 or £700,000 underspend, but it's sitting in corporate services. So we'll recover that back from. Sorry, it will be passed back across to the individual service areas. So that it's not quite playing shopkeepers, but it's actually how the funding is done.
Okay, I mean, it's just kind of difficult to take a view on whether corporate is performing when the cross-charging of costs, when costs fall where they lie rather than where they should be applied.
So I think part of that will come out as we've been readdressing the move within PMO or PMs around the council. As they're moving into the corporate service areas, their costs will go with them. They will remain within there. We're still in that sort of legacy piece where we've got bits of projects being ran by the PMO on behalf of E&E. So it's things like that. But we are actually now looking to embed the PMs inside those individual service areas.
Well, that will come with its own complexities and problems. We'll watch that with interest. Councillor Chowns.
Thanks. I've got 5 questions actually, but maybe I'll just ask 1 or 2 and then leave space in case anybody else wants to do others. I'll start with hopefully the simplest, which is just page 79, cross-directorate environments. Can you just explain what that is, please, in simple language? Page 79 of last week's budget pack. Corporate services, yeah, the list of pressures. So you've got, P1 is the pay award, P2 is the inflation pressures. So I understand what those are, but you've got £409,000 cost pressure in the next year from cross-directorate environments. What is that?
It's the movement between individual budgets, individual corporate service budgets areas.
But how does that make sense? How is that a cost pressure? How does it cost £409,000 extra just to move money from one budget to another?
If I can answer, it's not a cost pressure as such, it's the transfer of budget from a different area to reflect the transfer of services in there. So it's probably incorrectly termed as a pressure, but it's to show the movement and to get back to those figures.
So, for example, it's a cost that was previously held by, say, children's services, and it's now being taken into corporate.
I believe so, yeah.
Do we know?
Yes.
Do we know what it is? What the pressure is?
Joe, we'll provide a detailed breakdown because there are a number in there, so we'll happily provide that.
Great, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Okay, that was the simple question. The second one, so page 77, same document pack, shows that there's a £1.2 million overspend on the PMO in the current financial year. And this strikes me as slightly ironic / unfortunate, given that the PMO have the job of ensuring that projects are delivered on time and to budget. I can see you agree, Carol. It's a rather unfortunate place to have an overspend, isn't it? So, the department responsible for ensuring good management across the entire council has itself got a significant overspend. So I would like to know, what is the explanation and how are you going to ensure that this doesn't happen again?
Through Chair, yes, I'm very happy to pick this point up. This was at Q2, so that there has been some improvement. We have been working through the cost base for the PMO, and there have been reductions, so it is getting smaller and more focused. An element of that is how we recharge some of these projects, and some of the projects looked after by PMO I just dealt with because they're corporate projects, so some of the Section 106 work that they're looking at is driving some of that overspend. But I'm very happy. We'll make sure in Q3 report, which is due to Cabinet next month, we'll have a further explanation as to where the money is, and the intention is to bring that in as close as we can to a net position. As we say, there is already 400k in the special projects budget, which we're firing across.
Thank you. You'll forgive me, Andrew, if I'm not entirely reassured that my question has been answered there, but I think, it is clear that we have cross-party kind of agreement around the principle that our department responsible for good project management should itself demonstrate good project management. Thank you. A sort of related issue, really, is that Thrive, the transformation programme, is shown on page 84 as due to save £2.6 million next year, but in the current year there was a £1 million overspend on it. So again, we have a rather ironic contradiction between a project that is supposed to save us money and yet is going very significantly over budget. Same question, essentially. What is the cause of this? How can we have any confidence that this issue is going to be resolved and that we won't have this contradiction going forward?
Oh, so, Amy's here, so we'll go there. But the Thrive programme, as you're aware, Councillors, is the 4-year transformational programme, which is actually quite fundamental to everything that we're doing and the whole structure that we've got and way that we will structure the organisation to deliver services in a new, innovative, more effective and more efficient way. So I'll just refer to Amy to answer that particular question that you've got.
Thank you. So that investment is Investor Save in terms of the Thrive, as Councillor Soddats has mentioned, in terms of the Thrive Transformation Programme, which is a 3 to 4 year programme. Currently looking at that in terms of in-year as well with corporate directors and directors in terms of how we can, if there's any additional savings in year that we could look to recoup, but there's also within here demonstrating the further savings over the next sort of 24-25 with regards to Thrive and the Thrive transformation programme.
Thank you, Pete and Amy, but again, I don't really feel that that's a full answer to my question, which is how can, you know, if we've got a transformation programme that is overspending by nearly half the amount that it's supposed to be saving us, you know, year on year, then our assumptions about the cost benefit of this transformation programme look a little bit shaky. Should we not be assured that our transformation programme can take place at the originally estimated cost and deliver the savings that it is supposed to be delivering? You know, £1 million overspend is really quite significant.
Could I just sort of follow that up? I mean, if we've got projects that are going across financial year boundaries, and if we are front-loading the delivery of those, as we've talked about doing with the capital programme, in order to accelerate the rate at which savings are realised as a consequence of that work, what is the mechanism by which we pay ourselves back for pulling that work forward in order to balance things out across financial year boundaries, if that's how we do things? And if that isn't how we do things, how do we do things?
If I can pick up firstly, Chair, on Councillor Chalmers' point. So the £1 million overspend, that's part of the upfront costs that we put front for the 3 PwC initiatives. If I remember rightly, for service cost recovery, customer acceleration and robotic automation. So that was the money we paid up front to PwC to do that work, to put that in place. So that's what's pulled that £1 million there. However, what we then go into is the savings that will then be made in the next financial year. Sorry, I've got papers everywhere. Which shows that the Thrive programme under Saving S2, that's looking at effectively £2 million savings made on looking at reducing all of our contracts. So effectively all of the contracts that we have, when we renegotiate them, we'll be looking to drive those costs down, not by a blanket 10%, but we will use our commission officers to get them down as best as we can. We're also then looking at service cost recovery on other expenditures, third-party spend, and then also then looking at a 600k savings on customer acceleration robotics. So basically looking at the top 10 high-volume services we have. So it's ring about bins or whatever the top 10 are. We're then looking to make them using more robotic services to make them a much more efficient and cost savings. So you're correct. There is an overspend this year because of upfront loading, but we'll then recover that through the £2.5 million there.
Thank you. I don't want to flog this too much, but just to clarify, you know, I'm fully in favour of spending money now to save money in the long term. That makes sense. But when there's £1 million overspend on a transformation programme, it does make me wonder. And your explanation seems to suggest that overspend is because we've just done some things earlier, or is it because the things that we originally planned to do this year have just cost us £1 million more than we thought they were going to cost, or £1 million more than PricewaterhouseCoopers told us it was going to cost? So is it that we've just done more early and brought the expenditure forward into this financial year, or is it that actually the original cost estimates we had from PwC were overly optimistic and the reality is it's much more expensive to do this programme?
Partly down to timing differences. So as we were looking at the sequencing.
Sorry, is it A or B of the two options that I gave you?
C, timing sequences.
No, Pete, that isn't, that's not, you're not answering my question. Is it because, you know, the originally planned work has turned out to be more expensive than estimated, or is it because you've done stuff earlier?
I'll defer to Amy who's the lead on that one.
I suppose in a way it's a combination. We have been obviously working hard in year to identify those savings across those three areas that Councillor Stoddart has identified, and some will be realised within this year. As Councillor Stoddart has identified, that is investment into PwC with regard to supporting us to develop an transformation programme in year and over the following years. So we look to identify and invest a saving to bring them back, and on any transformation programme there is going to have to be some element of investment to ensure that we look to transform the organisation. But I can maybe see Paul's looking to come in here as well.
Through you, Chairman, if I may, I think we may not have helped ourselves here by putting it down in red as £1 million overspend. There's been an expenditure in year which is very much under the heading, as you described, Chair, as an investor save programme. The savings have not come through as quickly or as in the format we'd originally planned, and those are now included in future years. So we need to come up with a more appropriate way which accurately reflects the investment that's been made by the council in the Thrive programme to secure the information, knowledge where those savings areas are, and that we can then relate the investment to when the savings are actually being delivered, some in year and some of which are going to come next year, as Councillor Stoddart has described in the three areas of service cost recovery, customer acceleration and our third party spend. So I don't think we've helped ourselves in terms of how I presented it, if I may. I think it is. We need to rebadge this as investor save, with the cost being incurred in this year, so we're ultimately transparent, but the benefits coming through this year and into next, if that helps.
Thank you, Paul. I think perhaps an ongoing kind of report on savings realised in relation to investment made would help us to keep tabs on this over time. Thank you. Chair, I've got two more questions in this area, one on the Hoople SLA and one on the MERS saving. I'd particularly like to ask about MERS if nobody else does, but I'm conscious I've had the floor for a while. Maybe other people want to...
both of those, and people can indicate if they want to follow on in terms of either of those topics?
Well, very briefly on the Hoople SLA, we've got £2.1 million projected savings from, squeezing the Hoople SLA contract. What is that going to involve? What is it going to, what's the impact going to be in terms of real life services? But the question that I'm actually even more interested in an answer to, or even more concerned about, if you like, is the projected £4.5 million saving from the MERS scheme. I haven't written down what it stands for. Early resignation scheme, that's it, the early resignation scheme. And is there any strategy to this? Because I know that some posts are protected so that you won't have, all of your most senior social workers resigning en masse, and, that would be terrible. So there are some restrictions on who's eligible for MERS, but, the more posts are restricted, the more the unrestricted areas are subject to potentially, possibly large-scale people taking up the MERS scheme. And fundamentally, it seems to me a completely non-strategic way of reshaping the workforce, because it depends entirely on whether individuals want to take advantage of early resignation. And you could possibly end up with half of a team saying, well, right, we'll do that, with potentially devastating effects for that particular team's work or that particular service. Would it not make more sense to have a more strategic approach that says, what are the top priority services that we need to provide? Who are the people that we need in those jobs? How are we going to reshape accordingly, rather than cutting posts, because we just don't have enough money to pay everybody, through a resignation scheme that could potentially leave holes in important areas of our work?
And could I follow that up with a supplementary, which is around how the savings are shown as being taken? In the profile of the delivery of the savings, the slide shows all 4.5 million being recognised in Q1.
Thank you, Chair.
I think that...
second supplementary, is it?
That is... No, it's just that given the reluctance to recognise savings that are being predicted by both the Cabinet Member, the Chief Executive, the Leader and the Director in Children's Services this year, it seems at odds with that prudency, caution, to be showing all 4.5 million of the MERS savings being realised in Q1 of the new financial year.
Well, as a Scotsman, I've been very prudent. I will hope I'll give you the answers to those questions. So going back, first of all, to Councillor Chalmers, Hoople, as you're aware, Hoople they're a company, they make profit. We cannot, as the primary shareholder, we cannot get any returns on that, the way that the SLA and the governance is put in place. So what we're able to do is we have a discount on the services that we are provided with, and what commercial will be doing is driving that discount down even greater. So that's why we'll look to make some savings there, because we'll be getting the services less. So every £1 million of services, we'll only pay them 600,000 or whatever.
Yeah, that wasn't my question. My question was about the impact in terms of the council's ability to provide services, because Hoople basically provides services that help us provide our services. And if we are squeezing them as a provider, you know, as you say, they make profits, but it's effectively a company that we own ourselves anyway. So fundamentally, what's going to be squeezed here is the quality or consistency or scale or whatever of the services that they contribute to. What's the real life effect of that going to be?
The life effect is nil, that they will provide the same services for less money.
So you're saying Hoople is currently making £2.1 million of profit per year that we can just squeeze out of them?
And they will deliver services slightly differently, but they will still deliver the services. Moving on to your second question.
The point my colleague is making is that if there's £2.1 million of them making profit, then we've been overpaying them all of these years. You know, the reality is this is going to lead to a squeeze, a decline in the quality of services that the council is able to provide to residents. Which areas of our services is that going to affect if we cut Hoople?
I'll reiterate my point again, none.
So we've actually
we're
been
magicking
overpaying them.
£2.1 million out of thin air.
We're certainly not magicking money out of thin air. The slide's S6, it's got two elements to the saving, the total of 2.142 million, reduce 610,000, transform 1532. So the reduce is the reduction in getting the money back out, in effect, of the profits and surpluses Hoople has made from its arrangements, coming that back through. And the 1.5 million is about the transforming how they deliver services. So we have a range of activities that Hoople provide, which we're asking them to change, and we're working with them to change. So the one above, the GovTech solution. So what is happening there, where people want to change their arrangements for council tax. So you want to change the bank account or the date that your direct debit goes out, or claim a single person discount. At the moment, you can do that online, but that ends up on an officer's desk where they have to put that into the database. That's all changing, so we will have the ability to do it online. It will go straight into the database, and removing that steps of the manual handling. So that's an example of where they're transforming the service. So from a resident's point of view, nothing's changed. If anything, you've got a slightly more efficient system. And I'd encourage people to sign up for the My Account arrangement, which enables you access services, and why they might as well sign up for an electronic council tax bill, because that cuts down on paper. So there's things like that that are part of the transformation programme. There's a whole range of activities and services we're working with Hoople to transform and change, part of the wider Thrive programme. So we're asking Hoople to transform as well as the council doing its services. So I don't think thin air is the right phrase, but it is about a transformation. Hoople will work with them to do a range of different services or do them differently.
Thank you. That's a really helpful kind of illustration and example to make real how we can provide the same services in a different way that's actually costing us less. So thank you for that. And if it's possible, I think it's just useful to make this stuff concrete for people. Just to clarify, you started talking about Thrive and transformation in relation to Hoople, but just for full clarity, so the projected £2.1 million of Hoople savings is separate from the projected £2.6 million of Thrive-related savings next year. So transformation is a marvellous magic wand, isn't it? I'll be very interested to see if we get all of these savings coming through next year.
So, into addressing your the MERS question, what I can say is that again is linked in through the whole Thrive transformation program, because it's all about a strategy for delivering the services in a slightly different way, albeit it's the same services, in a more efficient and better way. So it's not a case of somebody has sat with a finger and said we need to save £4.5 million. It's a case of how can we deliver services in a more efficient way and a more innovative way, and actually we can then we're looking at posts. You're quite right, the way in which that has been developed, it's not just a case of we have certain areas across the council where we have said no one can apply for early resignation because they're critical workers. The rest of it, as I say, has been worked through with unions, and Tracy's not here, is she? No. Paul, are you able to give another quick burst on criteria?
Only to add that, yes, we've done that heavily consultation with the trade unions in terms of that criteria, and are working through, and we've had a considerable number of expressions of interest. We received a number of applications. That process is still open and running. We will be closing it, I think, at the end of next week, and then we'll make some decisions as to which of those applications to accept and confirm. And those which we will reject, and we will continue that work. The time scale for being is that those staff for whom MERS is agreed will then leave the organisation by the 31st of March, and therefore the savings can be confirmed from the 1st of April onwards.
Which, Chair, addresses your question about why has the full savings been taken in Q1, because the individuals will be gone by the end of March this year.
Can I just say that makes the assumption that you know that everybody, the amount of posts that you want to offer, that you're going to get 100% take up of this?
I suppose the reality, we'll only know whether we got 100% when we've completed the process that we're going through. It's still open at the moment, so we can't say one way or the other. Let's wait for the outcome before we make that final decision.
So it's not. It's still slightly based on an assumption that that's how it'll work out. That you're actually going to make that additional transformative saving of 4.5, because enough people will want to take advantage of that scheme. Does that mean that the flip side of that is, as you move to these electronic ways of working that you're talking about through my account, which do work very closely, work very well, then those posts that person you alluded to whose desk it lands on, who would then have to put it in manually, that post is no longer required. So there will be redundancies as well as early mutual resignations.
No redundancies, only resignations.
So you're assuming that the person who isn't needed anymore will be one of those people that will be taking advantage of this scheme?
Mr Lovegrove.
Okay, if I can help clarify. So the example I gave about the My Account arrangement for paying their council tax and changing those arrangements, that's a service carried out by Hoople. Hoople are looking to redeploy their people into different parts of the Hoople organisation, so they're not planning any redundancies either. So to be very clear, if anyone's listening, with clarity, that Hoople are not proposing to make any posts redundant on that side.
Okay. Is this on the Hoople or the MERS point? Okay, Councillor Fagan and then Councillor Stark, if the point hasn't been made, and then I'd like to query a point on support.
Thank you. I think it's just some clarification on the difference between a redundancy and an early resignation scheme, because does somebody who applies for the early resignation scheme, do they not kind of get any compensation then as they would do if they were being made redundant? So there's that question, and because obviously if it was a redundancy scheme, there would be additional costs, and I can't see sort of where the costs of an early resignation would be built in, and I think also it's again, there's no information on the impact on the service where that may where that early resignation may occur. So it then presents an anxiety that potentially there's an additional workload put on the existing workforce. And is there a kind of long-term implication that actually that workforce is then either unable to deliver the service or is actually stretched so badly that they become ill? So it's just there's no sort of real clarification on that. I haven't seen that as a councillor, so I don't have any information on how that scheme would work and the implications of it.
Through you, Chair, the MERS scheme has been, the council have had that scheme for an awful long time, so it's not a new scheme as such. It is a resignation process where the individual decides they want to leave the organisation, and if their application accepted, we agree. There is a compensation arrangement that links that, but it's not a redundancy situation, so we need to be very clear. Is people are choosing to apply for it. If they don't choose to apply, that's fine. If people do, part of the process when we've got all the applications in is to assess the impact on teams and the arrangements, and directors are very clear that they will work through the service implications. So we may turn around to some people and say we can't agree that application. I hope we don't get to the situation, but that is a possibility in terms of those arrangements. So we're working our way through. You make the valid point about what the impact for the staff that remain, and we have a workforce strategy, and there's a lot of support for people in terms of managing change and mental health issues. So we're not anticipating there being any significant impact on those, but clearly there will be a lot of support for staff, and this is something we've agreed with the unions as part of the process of rolling out the MERS process. The council will be slightly smaller in terms of the people it employs as part of this process. That's part of the reality of the financial situation that all councils face themselves in. So it's a process to enable people who want to leave in a way that is controlled and managed through their choice on there. That suits us as an employer, because if people want to go, let them go, and we will then end up being a smaller council.
Thank you. Can I just ask, how many positions is it anticipated that this will affect? What will be the reduction?
We haven't got a precise figure, and as the Chief Exec said, the process is still open, so I don't think it's appropriate to talk about individuals or numbers, but a number of people have asked for the information, and it will depend on their salary scales, exactly how many people go and how many people apply for. We have a figure in there, the 4.5 million. That is an estimate based on a series of assumptions, because that's all we can have at this point until we know the anticipated uptake of the arrangement. We may end up with more people applying than we anticipated, so as we said, and the Chief Exec said, there's a process to work out who we let go.
Councillor Stark, was your point covered?
No. It's only going to be quick, Chair. You know, I only ask simple questions, Carol. I said that this morning. I want to go back to Annex B and make this point, because I was going to make it earlier on when we look at MTFS. Chair, we are forecasting an increase under demands and pressures of about 3 million or 10%, Andrew. I suspect some of that will be due to inflation, but is some of that due to an increase in demand in services? Because if that's the case, Chair, I would want reassurance that if we're going to get an increase in certain areas. We heard about planning at a previous meeting. I know about the pressures right across E&E in terms of the front line, in terms particularly of enforcement. I'm just concerned that this has been looked at, and that you'll be able to cope with this increase that you forecast against this backdrop of MERS and the savings you expect to get from staff reductions?
Yeah, could I add to that? If we're looking at, if we're going back to the MTFS and looking at Annex B in terms of Councillor Stark's question, the lines towards the bottom of the table, which identify growth, demand and pressures and savings and efficiency mitigations, they drop off a cliff after next year. Is that because we find it increasingly difficult to predict them, or because they are basically what we would consider to be balancing known unknowns?
Through you, Chair, in terms of the Annex B and the forward projection, as Councillor Stark points out, there are assumptions built in there for future years for demand and growth in those pressures. That we have made clear assumptions, and people have worked through the detail of what they think those demand increases are going to be. As they get further out, then there is a degree of having to have an assumption base to drive that forward. There's no guarantees on there, and this is assuming that there are no major step changes in things like the provision of care, the number of children looked after children, those type of things, demand for services from the technical services, environment, health, trading standards. So that there's a set of assumptions that the directors have worked through. We have built in, I think it's 5.2 of the report, some sensitivity analysis on there. That's the overview in terms of the specifics of services. Then obviously the directors, and we could have picked that up last week.
I mean, the point I want to make, Chair, underline that, is there likely to be an offset because we have to increase staff in certain of the must-have services such as planning that could undermine the savings you're trying to make under MERS? That's the point I'm worried about, because these figures do seem to suggest that to some extent. Thank you.
What I can assure you is that what we believe as critical service areas within the council, planning, social services and certain other areas, those members of staff are not able, they're not enabled to actually apply for MERS.
Will we have an increase in those areas that offset the saving under MERS? We don't know, do we? That's the point I'm trying to make from these figures. We don't know whether we will have to grow some of our teams elsewhere to meet the demand that we're facing over the future years.
We're certainly not expecting that. Yeah, all the work we have done does not see any. Yeah, that's why we're offering MERS to reduce the size, because the way in which we'll deliver the service in the future under Thrive and Transformation will be a more efficient way.
So any increase in service demand will be met by transformation of service delivery. So if we are not investing in making more staff in certain areas, we could end up with more demand pressures on smaller teams.
No, because the tools that we're providing under the Thrive programme will enable them to deal with that potential, and again, I emphasise potential, growth in demand.
Okay, I think my question about whether those two lines are balancing known unknowns is probably a yes.
Yes, it is, because at this point it is a look forward, but the directors have got a lot of detail.
Yeah, because we can't possibly, given the trend in demand and pressures, it can't go, 32 million this year, 35 million next year, 15 the year after. It's going to be bigger than that, but we just don't know how big, and consequently we don't know what we might need to do in terms of transformation, savings, efficiencies, whatever, to offset that.
But we're using best practice from across government to project that, and these figures, they're not plucked from the air, they're actually measured based on best practice.
Are you Are you telling this committee that you're genuinely only expecting £15 million worth of demand and pressures to be hitting across the council in 2025-26?
Yes.
Oh, okay. We need to bear that in mind when we're looking at our recommendations then. Councillor Thomas, you're indicating.
Yeah, regarding staff, in all organisations, I suspect the council, well, I could see of it is the same. It's usually very top heavy with managers. Are you looking to get quite a few senior posts? Because at the end of the day, they only control, they don't actually do the work. So they only control the work done. Usually that is bad play to cut.
Thank you, Councillor. What I can say is that under the savings number 3 transformation target operating model, we are reviewing the senior management across the whole structure. So that's potentially looking at an £815,000 saving.
Okay, thank you for that question, Councillor Thomas. Could I ask a question? In last year's budget, recognising that there was a lot of financial hardship out there, and the administration in charge at the time was faced with needing to maximise the recommended uplift in council tax charge, which is the position that this administration also has presently. There was £1.7 million of funding provided specifically to deliver support to the hardest hit households, and that came from a combination of new homes bonus and additional interest earned on cash balances as a consequence of interest rate rises. I can't see in the budget figures as you have them presented that this provision is continuing, and given that you are proposing presently to increase to the maximum the council tax rise for the coming year, providing ongoing support of that level to the hardest hit households in addition to the council tax discount would seem to be a very necessary measure.
There's no planned change, and therefore that's why it's not shown in the papers. There's no change to it.
So that level of funding is continuing. I mean, I think it would be helpful both for this committee and for members when this comes to full council to make overt that provision is continuing in order to give some confidence, because that level of targeted support by far and away exceeds any, to that demographic group for the county, by far and away exceeds any benefit that they might receive from any level of council tax discount from the maximum applied across the council tax base. Leader, you're indicating.
Sounds like a good recommendation, Chair, to make that more explicit in the proposals. And can I just check with Mr Lovegrove about the take-up of that scheme in previous years?
Through you, Chair, it's a demand-driven opportunity, so we need to look at the data about the take-up, but it's there as a safety net for households that meet the criteria. The team are very good at working their way through that, so we'll provide the data of the take-up.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm very relieved to hear that that's still baked into the assumptions that you've got there. It's a really important offset for the requirement to maximise for those who are able to pay. Councillor Stark, I think we're coming towards the point where we do need to move on to reserves and then reflect on our recommendations.
I just want to ask this point. was there at any stage, either within Cabinet or among senior staff, to take the 4.6 million that you might gain in savings from MERS and actually use it to add to E&E to provide more resources in those areas under greatest pressure?
Yes, we discussed things like that, but equally we then have to sit to see how can we achieve the balance. So if we took the 4.5 million and gave it to E&E, where else would we make the savings to reduce the 4.5 so that you could get the balanced budget?
So there was never any opportunity to actually rebalance the budget in terms of perhaps these areas like planning, environmental health, trading standards, where all of us who are ward members keep getting residents coming forward saying, why aren't we properly staffed in these areas? Isn't that a bigger consideration in some respects? The fact that residents don't always see that we are delivering the service that we should be against what they expect.
As also with all the other services that we're mandated to provide and the discretion that we haven't. So there was a great deal of debate. This is not a 5-minute discussion. This took place over many, many weeks. All the pros and cons of each of the savings, and as a cabinet, we have come to the decision at the minute on the potential budget that we've got in front of you to those decisions.
Sorry, could I just query on the MERS activity? Is the figure that we're provided with of 4.5, is that a gross or a net figure? In other words, is there an element of the funding released by approving MERS applications in areas where we're minded to grant them, is some element of that being retained in order to invest in recruiting new members of staff, perhaps into areas where we have a need for developing new skills, new capabilities associated with delivering transformation or covering some of the points that Councillor Stark's made?
What I would say is that as I say, the critical areas, planning was definitely one of them, social services, children's services, that sort of area. The members of staff there are not enabled to apply for MERS. Therefore, there is no need to replace them because they're not leaving.
No, that's not the point. I'm really asking whether this is a net or a gross figure. Is there an element of, you're talking elsewhere in the budget about deleting all vacancies that are being held on directorate books. There presumably is a need to develop capability in new areas associated with transformation or doing things differently, or recruiting back into areas that have had people retire at senior level through the MERS programme, in order to refresh the staff base. Is that reflected in terms of the MERS figure being a net figure, or is this a gross figure and that kind of reinvestment in the staff base not showing in the budget?
It's a gross. There's no proposals whatsoever to increase staff. It's a staff reduction.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I think unless there are any burning questions, I think we need to move to cover the reserves item. Right, sorry, I missed that. We have...
In case the public get the wrong impression and staff, regarding MERS, you said we were not going to replace any vacant posts. There was a freeze on vacant posts. That's not correct. What we're looking at doing is where there's been a vacant post for a significant period of time and has not been filled, then we would look at not replacing that person. But if somebody left tomorrow and it was important that post be filled, then we would advertise that post.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Vice Chair, you've got some points on Treasury management. I think I thought we'd sort of covered Treasury management by dancing around that and capital, but if there's some outstanding points that we can cover quickly.
No, I think a lot of the points have, but there needs to be the opportunity for people to raise any points. I mean, from previous discussions, there were concerns over whether the rising cost of the MRP was going to be a pressure. And I think that was what stuck in my mind from pre-meeting discussions. I'm happy to go with your what you think is best, Chair.
Okay, well, there was a query which maybe you can provide some clarification on. In last year's Treasury Management Strategy, the MRP, the minimum revenue provision was identified as being 11.1 million on a forecast borrowing for the coming year of £165 million. At paragraph 3 of 3.9 of the Treasury Management Strategy, the report indicates that the Council's borrowing to March 2024 will actually be lower than was anticipated in the Treasury Management Strategy last year. So it's expected to be by the end of March this year 119.4 million, and that the minimum revenue provision for next year will need to be 9.3 million for a total estimated borrowing of almost what we'd anticipated last year for this year, which is 162.4 million by March 2025. So there was a query as to why the proposed MRP for the coming year is so much lower than it was for last year when the predicted level of borrowing is fairly similar.
Thank you, Chair. The committee a year ago, and I appreciate not many people here were on the committee there, had a comprehensive look at MRP, and there was a very clear paper and provided a lot of detail. So we'll make sure that that link is circulated to people so that there is that background information in terms of the Council's approach to MRP. In terms of the questions you just asked, all the calculations for MRP are driven by the forecast and the capital programme. I think, as we've mentioned before, the capital programme sits at this level. Actual spend is slightly lower, partly because of the slippage. So we have adjusted for that in the calculations. Rather than get into the detail here, I'm very happy to provide a written paper explaining the workings on there, if that would help to enable you time to move on to other items on the agenda, but we'll provide a written breakdown.
Yes, thank you. I think having that in writing would be of assistance. Councillor Chowns.
Thank you. I just want to, I'm not sure that this is specifically a question, but it's an observation and a concern that I want to share at this point, really. If we're looking at table 5, page 27, estimates of capital expenditure and funding, we can see that projected capital expenditure next financial year is going to more than double, and that the prudential borrowing component of that is going to more than triple relative to this year and more than quintuple. It's more than 5 times what we were borrowing with prudential borrowing 2 years ago. Now, while this is still within the framework of, you know, our restrictions on borrowing amounts and so forth, what it does mean is that we're essentially, you know, getting future taxpayers, future residents to pay more for stuff that we are borrowing, you are proposing to borrow this year. And that is shown very clearly in table 6, which is on page 30, which shows that the the ratio of the financing cost to the net revenue stream is increasing, quite significantly, by nearly a third within 2 years, from 7% up to 9%. So we're seeing the financing cost, the debt payment that we incur every year, going up from 13 million pounds this year up to 19.5 million pounds in 26, 27. Now that's a really significant increase, and it's unsustainable long term to have that level of increase, which is arising because we are borrowing much more at a time of high interest rates. So I'd really like to ask you, Councillor Stoddart, to kind of reconsider the strategy that you're pursuing at the moment, which is borrowing quite a bit at a time of high interest rates, because what that's going to do is drive up to nearly £20 million a year this council is going to be paying in interest payments on a base budget of roughly 200 million. So about 10% nearly of our income is going to be spent on that. And just that increase over those 2 years, that £4.5 million extra interest we're going to be having to pay, that's equivalent to 3% raise in council tax, as you well know. So it's really quite a risky strategy, I think. It's borrowing from the future to pay for things this year that we may have differences of opinion about whether they're sensible to spend on. But the fundamental financial point is that you are storing up significant costs for future taxpayers, not just 10 years down the line, but even 2 years down the line. And I think that's problematic.
Thank you. And I note your observation, but what I would still say is that our level of borrowing, as recorded against by Grant Thornton, we're still significantly lower than other unitary authorities, and it will be prudently borrowed.
I recognise that we're doing better than some other authorities, and I pay tribute to the prudent financial management of officers and indeed former cabinet members and so forth over recent years. But my point is that we are taking on more and more debt as a council at a time of increasing interest rates. So it's not really about whether we're doing better than all of the councils that are currently going bust because costs are rising all the time and the government's providing less and less funding. The question is, what costs are we storing up for future taxpayers? And like I just said, within 2 years, we're increasing the cost of interest payments by equivalent to 3% on council tax. That's really significant. And it means that we're going to have to find cuts elsewhere because we're going to be spending more and more of our money repaying debts for stuff that we're spending next year.
Again, I acknowledge your observation. And what I would say is that interest rates are now, as we've seen, are reducing, not increasing. So over the longer term, it will go lower. But it is something we need to be looking at. Andrew, you got any comments you'd like to make?
Well, that depends on whether we've got variable rate borrowings for all of this. Well, if it's fixed, then that is exactly my point. If we're taking out fixed term loans at a time when interest rates are historically high, we're fixing ourselves into difficulties.
Through you, Chair, the document before you is painting the potential for borrowing. We normally don't borrow that amount, partly because we internally lend to ourselves. And I know there's a training session on last Friday with Link that we historically underborrow because we use our working capital effectively. So that is the cheapest form of borrowing. All our current loans are at fixed rates, and we have got a whole spectrum of rates because they were fixed at times. So we've got some in the portfolio at 10% or even higher. As Councillor Stoddart has said, rates are dropping, and this is a forward look. So at the moment, we don't know when we will need to borrow, but it'll be at some point in the future, and we'll take the market rate at that point. All the indications are that rates are dropping, so the longer we can delay, the cheaper the money becomes in terms of arrangements. We don't normally get into variable rate borrowing arrangements because that's a risk that we don't normally want to take, and certainly my advice would be not to do that. So any future borrowings would be at a fixed rate, but with the rate at the time. But there is certainly a downward trend in the rates, and that's certainly what the market is predicting, and our advisors are.
There's a downward trend in the rate, but there's a really significant upward trend in the amount that this council and therefore our residents are going to be having to pay in interest payments because of what you are seeking to borrow. The really significant increase in projected borrowing. I don't think that's a terribly responsible approach.
Okay, thank you for making those points in the room, Councillor Chowns. I think if we've covered that Treasury management gap, can we briefly cover reserves, please?
Chair, before we go ahead, it's 5 o'clock, the meeting is we've just allocated 3 hours, so I think we need to ask the committee whether or not they wish to continue.
Okay, hopefully this will be a brief item and then we need to agree our recommendations. Can I seek your permission, committee members, to extend the meeting until a maximum of 5:30? Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Brilliant, thank you very much. On the subject of reserves, we have a table on...
I have a meeting at 6 o'clock, I won't stay to 5:30.
Okay, well, let's hope we don't make it to 5:30. If you can canter through reserves, we can get straight to recommendations and be away. And thank you to Cabinet members and officers for sticking with us for a little bit longer. The reserves are in the supplement on page 15, and they're showing in a table there. The question that I've got on these, I've got two questions. One is we've got a line in there showing that the overspend from children's services is being proposed with effect from Q2 to be covered from reserves as a way of dealing with that, because it's too much for us to be able to deal with in any other way in year. What we're not seeing in the way that these figures are presented is where that money is going to come from across our general and earmarked reserves. It does state in the words of the MTFS, I think, that we are going to be reviewing our earmarked reserves in order to find that funding. The problem for me is that this overspend has been being forecast from since June, and the decision was made at Q2 in September that it would come from reserves. And, you know, I'm concerned to see where you are proposing to take that money from, because earmarked reserves are earmarked with a rationale as to why we want to set that money aside and what it is to be spent on. And therefore there are consequences associated with reducing those earmarked reserves, some of which I think are ring-fenced funds for very particular things that we can't touch. So some of these lines are out of bounds and others will, you know, fall disproportionately towards funding this, this quite significant sum of money. Also, we're told that the General Reserve is, you know, looking healthy in terms of the statutory minimum that we're required to provide. But also it would be helpful for this committee, for members ahead of the full council decision, to understand where this money is going to come from. And I think I would like to be seeking support from members of the committee for a recommendation on this, that it is actually, you know, that where this money is coming from in year for the 31st of March is actually identified in this table, so that we can all be clear on what the money movements are that will have to take place by the 31st of March in order to balance the books for this financial year. So that's one point. I'm not expecting answers in the room now, but I think that information should be provided so that we can all be clear on that, and the consequences of it for the lines that are going to have funding removed and the risks associated with doing that. So I think a bit of a narrative around that is required. And the other question that I've got on reserves is that there's been very little utilisation of the earmarked grants that have been carried forward in this financial year compared to last. Do you have more information on the detail of what these comprise and whether continuing to hold these back in reserves is delaying progress in making investments in areas of the council's operation or, you know, the county, and what the reason is for doing very little with them this year?
Chair, can I ask a supplementary to that? If they're grant money, are they time sensitive? And would they then have to go back if they weren't spent as envisaged this year?
Thank you, Chair. So, firstly, thank you for acknowledging that back in September we made it clear on the Q2 report that we will be looking to reserves. As part of the normal routine financial management in Q4, a decision we made as part of that process, which of those reserves we will go to which was the most appropriate at that time. As I say, that is normal financial prudent management at the end of the financial close down processes. To pick up your second point about the earmark grants, we'll provide you with the details of those grants and if any of them are time sensitive.
Chair, some of those grants we have to spend them in a certain time frame, and some of those we get from government will have a long time frame. So we've just received an announcement last week that we're about to get £1.8 million capital grant for providing certain things to be provided in the spring of 2026. So it's not unusual to have money sitting there in earmarked grants that we hold for quite a while, because we have to meet the criteria, or government will tell us, or the grant making body can say, and it can be a couple of years in front of us. So that's not an unusual position, but as Councillor Stark will provide the breakdown.
Okay, thank you for that. And, you know, given that you have received some late information about some extra money coming in, it gives me the opportunity to ask the question, given the draft settlement information that was provided in December, is there any additional funding that has been provided as a consequence of that, or indicated as a consequence of that, that is not reflected in the most up-to-date information that we've had provided to us here?
Through you, Chair, the paper you saw last week about the revenue budget was very clear that an update will be brought to the Cabinet at the end of the month around the outcome of the draft settlement. The draft settlement was announced just before Christmas. The consultation process closed this morning, and I know there have been a number of representations. What I can say, when you look at the draft settlement for Herefordshire, in terms of the grant adjustments, we actually lose about £100,000 worth of grant, money in, money out, so that the grant settlement has reduced. We are allocated an additional amount for New Homes Bonus, about £800,000, and there's some technical adjustments in terms of the arrangements for business rates. At the moment, the proposal is there is flat cash for the Rural Services grant on there, and if you know, last year we made the point through the Rural Services Network that actually is a real terms cut. I know that Councillor Phillips has been speaking to ministers today. I've just had an email while we've been in the meeting pointing out that is a challenge for us. So the MTFS, and you're assuming flat cash, let's be hopeful that his conversation will bear fruit and we'll get some more money, but we'll provide an update as soon as we hear about that.
Okay, thank you. I mean, given that officers have been as diligent as they have in trying to provide the most up-to-date information to us in the updated papers that have been provided, you know, it's nice to hear in the room about that information, but it might have been nicer to have been able to have had that as a you know, as a sort of an addendum to the figures that went to Cabinet in December for us to be able to consider. Going back to your answer, Councillor Stoddart, in terms of where the money's going to come from for the 13.8, I recognise that it may be that there is not a final decision on this. However, it would be helpful and, you know, appropriate in transparency terms for an indication to be provided to members as to where you plan to get this money from in order to balance the books this year, particularly given that, you know, over the last 3 years, about 30 million pounds has had to be taken to spend on children's services, and, you know, we're running very thin on where we've got to go to find money to plug the gaps. And it goes back to the concerns that I was raising earlier in the meeting as to what degree of confidence we have and we should have in terms of delivering a balanced budget and defendable balanced budget to full council, that, you know, we understand, you know, and we make the necessary adjustments in order not to build undefendable risk into the financial figures that we put before full council. But I think understanding where our pips are squeaking against our general and earmarked reserves in finding this 13.8 million, at least giving an indication, would be appropriate.
Again, the 30.8 million was the estimate at Q2, so it could we'll find out with Q3 very soon, and then hopefully into Q4. The review for which of the various earmarked reserves and general fund balance, that's ongoing as we speak, and will of course be reported as part of the outturn after the year end. But we will look to give you an early advisory on where we believe we'll be going to, but it may not be until the actual Q4 is finished.
These figures are being presented as part of the evidence supporting the budget. We have to take them on the, you know, as the evidence that you're providing supporting your budget. If you're going to be providing in these figures what you are referring to as forecasts for the end of the year, you're already indicating that they're not, you know, cast in stone, but these are your forecasts. I would like to be seeking committee member support for a recommendation to be that you also provide a forecast of where you're going to be getting this 13.8 from across our reserves.
Yes, and we can provide you with a forecast, but the final result will be in the Q4 outturn.
Understood, but I think that forecast is an important piece of information to take to full council. Thank you. Members, any further questions on reserves? Councillor Fagan.
Yeah, Chair, it was just a quick one about the designated schools grant, because that obviously at the moment is sort of ring fenced, but that, as far as I understand, is only for the sort of next financial year ahead. And does that pose a threat to our reserves as well? Is it 1.2 million from that grant? Sorry, from the overspend for the special needs. So it's just, are we building in some sort of option as to how this will be dealt with? I'm just a bit, given that we know that kind of high needs demand is increasing. There you go. It says here that the risk cannot currently be mitigated. Expenditure will be monitored and part of routine budget monitoring arrangements. But the high needs deficit, 1.1 million at 31st of March 2023, sits as a negative unusable reserve on the balance sheet, permitted by via a statutory instrument, and that this statutory instrument expires at the end of 25-26. So it says there with implied risk to the general fund and overall financial position if the council is required to fund the deficit. So is there some sort of mitigation in place, or is it just a case of we're just going to wait and see what, you know, what happens, whether we do end up overspending, which given the national picture looks like that's a strong possibility, and whether the government, whichever government it is at that time, actually deals with this issue.
Joe, if I pick that, it's quite a technical area because the issue of overspends in DSG environment, we have various statutory overrides put in place by government telling us how to treat. So if you just read from the MTFS, that we have followed the statutory guidance, and they're very clear that for that guidance will be in place until the end of 25-26 and March 26. At that point, the government of the day will either address it or will give us a further statutory right. So we don't know at the moment what the outcome will be. This has been reported, and every council, just about every council in England and Wales, has the same problem, that there is a DSG overspend, and government are saying they will find a solution, but we've not had that solution presented yet. So we are complying with the statutory override. We're waiting for further government guidance. We're not likely to get that before we set our budget in February, but we've made it very clear in the papers that's the situation we're in. Ultimately, we could ultimately be asked to fund that. Every council land would be the same, and I think that there will be a very significant lobbying effort from all councils if that is the government's position.
So potentially in the future it poses a risk to our reserves.
And that's what we've said in the MTS. There is a latent risk there, but at the moment we have the statutory override and government saying there have been various undertakings. They will find a solution to this. We just don't know what that solution will be.
Thank you, members. And with that, are we closing our questioning and moving to identifying recommendations from the last meeting and whether any of them have been addressed as a consequence of information provided in the interim, and recommendations from this meeting? I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all our officers, particularly the finance team, for all of their hard work and, you know, a lack of having a Christmas and a New Year and seeing their families and all the rest of it in order to pull this information together on the statutory timescales. And thank you to Cabinet members who've stuck with us to the end, even though we haven't called on all of you to answer questions. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. And same goes for Leader and Chief Executive. Thank you very much. Members, I think we need to be reminded of the draft recommendations that came forward from last week's meeting, and I'd seek the assistance from officers in prompting us on those.
Thank you, Chair. I still have in my possession here a list of fairly unfiltered notes, and I think one of your jobs is going to be to determine which of these are actions and which you want to take forward as recommendations. So there's about 2, 4, 6, 8. There's about 10 from your meeting last week, and I've noted about half a dozen more actions and recommendations so far from this one. So I can't promise I've got all of them, and I know there was some fairly loose talk about things that might be recommendations and haven't necessarily captured them. So do you want me to go through these in turn? And
is it possible for you to put them up on the screen for people to see while you go through them?
Can I share that?
If you join the team meeting.
To put on that. Then what do I do?
Go to Drive. Just click anywhere. Silk. Press launcher.
Okay.
Takes a wee second.
Right, okay. Well, that's challenging my eyes, I'm afraid. So if you can, read them out.
Okay.
Okay.
As a reinstatement of the detail of the local account for adult social care. There was greater promotion and understanding of funding arrangements for adult social care, a more systematic review of self-funders likely to run out of resources and to fall into our responsibility. There was actions around early help, around all age commissioning, to be kept as a separate budget line, to seek clarity on the allocation and use of all ages social care fund, greater clarity on send transport, which you suggested you send to the Children and Young People Scrutiny Committee, evidence justifying income targets within planning, and mapping of income to support services and how they manage that in year. More detail on the Balfour BT Living Places savings in, noted as S2 in the reports delivered on the 10th January. You suggested that the S8 saving, as detailed on the 10th of January, is listed as an income rather than a saving, and that you reprofile savings to ensure that they reflect actual delivery, were the suggestions made in that meeting on the 10th.
Okay, well, starting at the top, it wasn't, the suggestion was that there used to be a public local account report produced annually for indicating how adult social care funding had been spent through the year and what the services were that were delivered. And I think that was the recommendation on that one, that to reinstate the publication of a public local account to inform the public as to the way that adult social care funding was spent annually by the council, and that was something that the director was supportive of. So that was the first recommendation. The second one was around the risk that was presented by us not having contact with all of the self-funders in the county of their residential care ahead of them coming to the point where they can no longer support their own care packages. And there was a request that there was some assurance provided as to what the approach was going to be that would be taken in adult social care in order to develop that relationship with self-funders that we don't presently have, because that was going to be a mitigation for what we were seeing as a developing risk that was going to fall to the council. So that was a recommendation for what I think that was a recommendation for action, and some information to come back probably to the Adult Social Care Scrutiny Committee to give them a bit more detail on what was going to be happening in preparing for that. Something about early help is not very helpful.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate it, but that's all I have.
Okay. Okay, well, we'll hop over that for a minute. There was a recommendation that the funding for all age commissioning, rather than being wound into the budget for adult social care, was retained as a separate, a discrete line in the budget as it has been for this financial year. And the way that the figures were presented when it comes to full council, that there is clarity in terms of how the ring-fenced element of the council tax for adult social care is brought out in the way the figures are presented, and my recollection is that I think the medium-term financial strategy might already have actioned that in terms of showing the ring-fenced adult social care funding and its predicted level for future years in the table in Appendix B. But that was really an action for officers in terms of the way that the figures are presented for Cabinet and for full council. Action to children and scrutiny, young person scrutiny in terms of investigating send transport end to end and how the information and pipeline is understood and managed. Okay, there was a question mark over whether planning actually had or did not have a structural deficit in terms of its income target, and if it doesn't have one, that there is supporting evidence that there is a pipeline to justify the level of income that it is being targeted to deliver, because it hasn't delivered that level of income over the last 2 or 3 years. So that's a recommendation in order to assist in justifying the balancing of the budget that's brought forward. BBLP savings, we were asking for more information to be provided ahead of this meeting. We haven't had it, but there are consultations that are underway presently with members on the options. But again, I think by the time this comes to back to Cabinet, that it would be helpful if there was some clarity on how that 450 million, how that 450k is being proposed to be broken out against services in the annual plan. And I think the public will be quite keen on that, particularly given the way that some of the previous years' cuts have impacted on services.
Is that a recommendation, Chair?
That's a recommendation, yeah. S8 saving list it as, oh yes, that was something that was income that was showing, that was an increased income that was showing as a saving. So that's really an action in terms of how the information is presented. And there was a general request across all of the directorate savings in terms of how they're presented, that there is a relook given to whether they are reflecting how the savings are actually going to be delivered against the quarters, and just asking for a sense check on that. So I think that was an action. Shout out if any members of the committee are recollecting differently on that. Any help with the early help?
I'm just trying to remember.
I think what was coming out of it was that for us, that children's scrutiny and the adult scrutiny actually potentially work together to look at the early help offer across the board. It was certainly something that became evident during the discussions, is that actually a lot of the early help, that provision that's being made in the county, is actually going through the adult and communities directorate rather than through the children's directorate.
Particularly talk community and this work that needs to be done about prevention.
Yeah.
It was noted in the meeting that both committees were essentially tackling the same issue from different angles, and it might be worth both chairs taking some time to sort of plan that work and perhaps return back with something unified rather than sort of working separately.
Okay, was there also a question about sufficiency in terms of whether the investment that was being made in early help, commissioning early help services was being targeted appropriately and meeting the needs that were causing deprivation and concern in terms of the environment for children? No. No,
So,
yes, no.
It is certainly something that we've discussed. I'm not entirely sure that we sort of raised it as a recommendation, but it was under discussion.
We'll leave that as an action then, that the two scrutiny committees look at how they're going to keep an eye on that. Recommendations from today. I've got down that we were recommending that the best practice in terms of the SIPFA and Treasury Management guidance from Link was confirmed as being followed, and that the information was available for all lines in the capital programme.
That was more around the Chair. I think that was more around the business cases we're adhering
Yes.
to.
Yeah, the business cases were following the list of best practice points that have been provided by Link. Can we?
Chair, if I might, there's we're now at 5:30 again now. We would have to, if we're going to agree these, we're going to have to take an adjournment to rewrite them, to draft them, then to come back and then to vote on them. I don't think you've got time to do this in the space of this meeting going forward now. I think, I'm not quite sure.
We can't leave it hanging. We have to finish and have some recommendations.
And then we're going to need to take an adjournment. I'm going to recommend we take an adjournment so we can actually agree the wording of all of these, because at the moment all we have is rough notes. So I think I would suggest we take an adjournment and we thrash them out, we rewrite them, and then we put them back on the board and agree them. I would remind you this meeting is still live at the moment.
Indeed.
And I have my screen on here and my unfiltered notes. I'm not sure that this is a particularly good way of drafting the recommendations. I suggest we take an adjournment to continue this work offline and come back on and agree them.
Okay, well, we'll do a 10-minute adjournment then. Okay, thank you everybody for bearing with us while we did a bit of wordsmithing. What we've done is focused on sorting out what the recommendations are from the committee's 2 sessions on the budget. We have a number of action points which will be captured in the minutes and provided to officers in order to update documentation in time for a revised version of the budget to go to Cabinet and on to full council. But as far as the recommendations are concerned, we have 7, and I'll just ask officers to read those out now for us, please.
Thank you, Chair. They are as follows. 1. That income and charging detail is provided for services in each directorate. 2. Investment in and level of targeted support is made clear in the budget. 3. Evidence justifying income targets within the planning service are provided. 4. Ongoing monitoring of performance in areas where MERS savings were taken for the 24-25 financial year. 5. To provide more detail on the proposed savings with regard to the BPLP contract. 6. For the administration to provide a forecast of where they are minded to adjust earmarked and general reserve lines to deliver the required £13.8 million to cover the overspend forecast at Q2 in children's services. And 7. To provide further evidence to give confidence that the savings of £2.5 million in the Children and Young People Directorate are deliverable based on evidence from Q3 and Q4 2023-24.
Thank you. Now, committee members, are you content to take a vote on those recommendations en bloc? Excellent. Okay. Could I request that somebody propose them? Councillor Fagan, I'll second them from the chair. If we can take a vote on those, then in favour. Oh,
So just to point out, Councillor Thomas can't vote.
no, I recognise that. I'm grateful for your support online, Councillor Thomas, but I'm afraid you can't vote because you're not in the room with us. However, I note that you are supportive of those recommendations, and thank you for that.
And indeed still with us, thank you.
So, members in favour? Thank you. That's unanimous. Okay, thanks everybody. Sorry there's been an overrun on this. It's been emotional. So thank you very much, and I'll just close the meeting. Do we have a date of next meeting for Scrutiny Management Board to March the 19th? Okay, so date of next meeting scheduled for Tuesday the 19th of March 2024 at 2 p.m. And with that, I'd like to close the meeting and thank everybody for their attendance. Thank you.